The magistrate didn't knock. He walked through the front doors of Silverheart Manor like he already owned it. 3 soldiers at his back, a writ of seizure in his hand, and the particular expression of a man who had been paid well to destroy someone else's life. He dropped the document on Evelyn Hawthorne's reception desk without looking at her. "You have until sundown to vacate the eastern warehouse." He adjusted his rings. "We'll begin inventory of your trading licenses tomorrow." The clerk behind the desk went pale. 2 maids froze in the corridor, and Evelyn Hawthorne, the wealthiest woman in 3 northern provinces, a woman who had built an empire from nothing but intelligence and refusal to be beaten, stood very still and looked at the magistrate the way you look at a fire that hasn't reached your house yet, but will. "Is this the chapter where everything I've built gets taken by men who've built nothing?" she asked. He smiled. "It's the chapter where you learn that no fortune is large enough to protect you from the crown." If you've been watching this channel, you already know I don't tell comfortable stories. I tell true ones, the kind where good people are pushed to the edge before they find out what they're actually made of. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let me take you back to where it all began, to a winter night 3 weeks before that magistrate walked through the door, when a ragged stranger with 3 copper coins changed everything. The storm came in hard from the northwest, the kind that didn't announce itself with gradual cooling or distant clouds. It arrived all at once, as if the sky had simply decided it was done being reasonable. By the time the wind reached the northern frontier, it was throwing ice sideways, and the road that ran past Silverheart Manor had become something between a river and a mistake. Evelyn was in her study reviewing the month's accounts when her head housekeeper, a stout and sensible woman named Mrs. Aldrich, appeared in the doorway with the expression she reserved for problems that were beneath the manor's dignity but couldn't be ignored. "There's a man at the gate," Mrs. Aldrich said. Evelyn didn't look up from her ledger. "What kind of man?" "The frozen kind." Evelyn set down her pen. She didn't go to the gate herself. That wasn't how things were done at Silverheart, where every function had its designated person, and Evelyn trusted those people to do their work. She sent her gate steward, a careful man named Breck, with instructions to assess the situation and report back. What Breck reported back was this: a man, somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a coat that had been good quality once, several years and many hard miles ago. No horse, no luggage beyond a canvas sack that appeared nearly empty. He'd given his name as Lucy. The end. He'd asked, very politely, for the price of the cheapest room available, and when Breck had told him, the man had opened his hand to show 3 copper coins and asked if there was perhaps something cheaper still. "He's not drunk," Breck added. "He's not. He doesn't carry himself like a vagrant. He spoke clearly, asked politely. But he's got no money, and he's going to be dead by morning if someone doesn't take him in." Evelyn looked at the window. The ice was hitting the glass hard enough to sound like gravel. "What room is available?" Breck hesitated. "The servants' quarters have a spare bunk, my lady, or the supply annex has a cot. What's the state of the Meridian suite?" The hesitation that followed was longer. "It's prepared. We keep it ready in case." "Put him there." Breck stared at her. "My lady, the Meridian suite is our finest. I'm aware of what it is. Put him there, have the kitchen send up a proper meal, and see that he has dry clothes from the house stores. Whatever fits." Breck left with the uncertain expression of a man who had been given clear instructions he couldn't understand the logic of. Mrs. Aldrich, still in the doorway, said, "The staff will talk." "The staff always talks," Evelyn replied, and picked up her pen. She didn't go back to the ledger numbers, though. She sat with her pen resting against the page and thought about the way Breck had described the man. The coat that had been good quality, the polite manner of speaking, the deliberate count of 3 copper coins. People who had never had money didn't handle it that way. They either clutched it or they didn't bother counting because they'd stopped expecting it to be enough. The way Breck described it, this man had looked at those coins the way someone looks at a situation they've already calculated and made their peace with. That was the detail that had made her say the Meridian suite instead of the servant's bunk. She couldn't have explained it precisely. She'd built her fortune on reading situations faster than other people did, and something in the description of 3 copper coins held with that particular kind of acceptance had told her something she couldn't articulate yet. She went back to her numbers. She didn't meet him until the following morning, and it wasn't planned. Evelyn rose before dawn by habit, the habit of a woman who had learned early that the hours before the rest of the world woke up were the most useful hours of the day. She dressed without calling her maid, took her coffee from the kitchen herself, and went to walk the South Garden path where she thought best. The South Garden in winter was not decorative. The ornamental plants were all covered or cut back. The fountain was drained, and what remained was a series of gravel paths between bare earth and dormant hedgerows. She liked it better this way. It was honest. She was on her second pass of the outer path when she nearly walked into him. He was crouched near the corner where the garden wall met the stable fence, examining a section of stone that had shifted and left a gap. He had a piece of broken slate in one hand and appeared to be testing whether it could be wedged into the gap as a temporary fix. He was wearing borrowed house clothes that were too short in the sleeve. His dark hair was uncombed, and he was so focused on the wall that he didn't hear her until she was 6 feet away. He stood quickly, not startled, controlled, like a man whose instincts had been trained to respond to proximity without showing alarm. "My lady," he lowered his head slightly. "I apologize. I wasn't aware you walked this path." She looked at the broken slate in his hand. "The groundskeeper knows about that gap. It's on his list. It's letting in the cold air. The horses in the near stall were restless last night." He paused, as if realizing he'd just explained himself to someone who hadn't asked for an explanation. "I'm sorry. It's not my concern." "How do you know the horses were restless?" "A beat. I couldn't sleep. I heard them." She looked at him for a moment. Actually looked. The way she looked at ledgers when she suspected the numbers were hiding something. His face was weathered, but not rough. His hands, she noticed, had the kind of calluses that came from physical work, but his posture had something in it that didn't match the worn coat and the 3 copper coins. He stood like a man who was accustomed to being the tallest person in a room, not in height, but in presence. "Did you eat?" she asked. "The kitchen sent up a meal last night. More than enough, thank you." "I mean this morning. No." "Come to the kitchen, then." She turned and walked back toward the house without checking whether he followed. He followed. The kitchen at Silverheart was the warmest room in the building in winter, and also the most chaotic between 5 and 7 in the morning, when the breakfast preparations for a full house staff were underway. Evelyn moved through it with the ease of someone who'd grown up in working rooms, pulling a stool to the end of the work table and nodding for Lucian to take the one beside it. The cook, a broad woman named Sana, who had been with Evelyn for 11 years and had therefore stopped being surprised by anything her employer did, set a plate in front of each of them without comment. Lucian looked at the plate, thick bread, eggs, cold pork, half a roasted potato, and said nothing for a moment. "You don't have to wait," Evelyn said. "I was going to say thank you." "You already said thank you twice." He picked up the fork. 3 copper coins doesn't buy a great deal of gratitude, apparently. It was dry, almost funny. She looked at him sideways. "It bought you the Meridian suite, so I'd argue it's punching above its weight." Something moved across his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite embarrassment. "I noticed the room wasn't the servants' quarters." "The servants' quarters were full." "Were they?" "No," she said. "But that's the story we're using." He was quiet for a moment, eating with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely hungry but had enough self-discipline to eat slowly anyway. Then he said, "Why?" She considered the question. It was a fair one. She'd been asking herself a version of it since the night before. "Because, the way your man described it, you counted 3 coins and asked if there was something cheaper," she said. "People who are trying to take advantage of someone's charity don't do that. They ask for the best and see how much they can get. You were trying to take up as little space as possible." She picked up her coffee. "I find that more interesting than most of the people who walk through my doors." He looked at her then, directly, for the first time. Brown eyes, tired but sharp. "I'm not interesting," he said. "I'm just someone who ran out of road." Where were you headed? A pause. North. North is a direction, not a destination. Sometimes that's all you have. She let that sit. Outside, the storm had stopped and the kitchen windows showed the pale gray of a winter dawn starting to arrive. Around them, the kitchen staff moved and chopped and called to each other in the comfortable shorthand of people who work together every day. You can stay, Evelyn said. Not in the Meridian Suite indefinitely. That would confuse the staff. But I have a room on the east wing that's separate from the servants' quarters. It's decent. And if you want to be useful while you're here, my stable master could use another pair of hands who apparently notices when horses are restless. He set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. You don't know anything about me, he said. I know you didn't sleep, and you spent the first light of morning trying to fix a wall that wasn't your problem. She finished her coffee. That tells me enough for now. He stayed. He didn't make a formal agreement, didn't sign anything, didn't give her more than a first name and a vague account of having come from the central provinces after a long stretch working security for a trade company that had dissolved. She didn't press. She had a sense, bone deep and unexplained, that pressing would cause him to leave, and she wasn't ready for that yet, though she couldn't have said why. What she could say was that within 3 days the stables were running differently. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't announce changes or summon anyone to a meeting. He just started doing things, and then the things got done better, and the people who worked around him started doing their own things better, almost without noticing it. He'd spend an hour with a stable boy showing him a more efficient method of stacking feed, and the next morning the boy would be showing someone else. And by the end of the week, the entire stable section was organized in a way that saved an hour of labor every day. Breck noticed first because Breck noticed everything. He came to Evelyn on the 4th day and said, "The man you put in the east wing." What about him? He rewrote the watch rotation for the gate guards. Nobody asked him to. He just made a chart and left it on the guardhouse table. Evelyn looked up. Did it cause problems? No, Breck said. It's better than the old one. It covers the north approach, which the old one didn't. I want to know how he knew to worry about the north approach. Did you ask him? He said he just noticed there was a gap. She thought about the wall in the south garden, the gap letting in cold air, the horses restless. He notices gaps, she said. Breck chewed on this. He's not who he says he is. He hasn't said who he is. He said his name is Lucien and he used to work security. Men who used to work security don't rewrite tactical watch rotations and get them right on the first try. No, Evelyn agreed. They don't. They looked at each other. Do you want me to look into him? Breck asked. Not yet. She turned back to her desk. Let him keep noticing gaps. The first real test came at the end of the first week, and it came fast. One of Evelyn's supply caravans, 7 wagons, a full load of winter textiles heading to the valley markets 3 days south, was stopped an hour out of the manor by a gang of 8 men who had been working the northern road for 2 months. They were organized enough to be professionals, and the caravan guards, 3 men with crossbows and a driver who could handle a team, were outmatched before the first exchange. What the bandits hadn't counted on was Lucien. He wasn't supposed to be with the caravan. He'd been in the warehouse district helping reorganize the shipping manifest when someone came running to say the caravan had been stopped. Evelyn was still at the manor. The decision was made in the time it took to breathe once. He took a horse from the stable, 2 of the gate guards who were nearby, and rode hard. What happened next was described to Evelyn by 3 different witnesses, and the accounts were consistent enough that she believed them. He didn't charge in. He stopped his group on the ridge above the road and spent 4 minutes studying the situation, the positions of the bandits, the configuration of the wagons, where the caravan guards were pinned down, what the terrain on the east side of the road looked like. 4 minutes. The gate guards were ready to move before that, and he made them wait, and they obeyed without fully understanding why. Then he gave them a plan. Specific. Detailed. Who went where, in what order, on what signal. 1 gate guard to the eastern ridge to be visible and loud. The other to circle the lead wagon from the north side, also visible. Lucien himself would approach directly, alone, slowly, in the open. He just rode down the middle of the road, one of the caravan guards told Evelyn later, still slightly awed by it. Right toward 8 armed men, no armor, one sword, like he was going for a morning ride. She asked what he said to the bandits. He told them they had 3 options. Take the money from the road fund, which was about 40 silver, emergency cash the caravan always carries separate from the main goods, and leave. Or try to take the wagons and deal with what was coming from both ridges. He paused. There was only 1 man on each ridge, my lady. But they didn't know that. And the way he said it, you'd have believed there were 50. What was the third option? Evelyn asked. He didn't say. He said, I'll give you time to consider the third option, but I'd recommend against it. And he waited. The bandits took the 40 silver and left. She found Lucien in the stable when the caravan returned, brushing down the horse he'd ridden. Not dramatic, not telling anyone what had happened, just taking care of the horse. Breck tells me you got there in time, she said from the stable door. The timing was manageable. He kept brushing. Your road fund carries too little. 40 silver isn't enough to make bandits feel like they've won something substantial. They'll be back within a month. I'd suggest increasing it to 100 and changing the pickup day so the caravan doesn't leave on a predictable schedule. She leaned against the door frame. You could have waited for me to make that decision. I could have. He looked at her over the horse's back. But you weren't there, and the caravan was. She watched him. 8 armed men, she said. And you rode down the middle of the road. He said nothing. Most people with any sense of self-preservation wouldn't do that. Most people haven't learned what I've learned about the difference between actual danger and the appearance of danger. He returned to brushing. Men who are professionals are usually rational. Give them a way to take what they came for without dying, and they'll take it. It's the amateurs who are unpredictable. And if they'd been amateurs, he was quiet for a moment, then I would have done something different. He said it simply, without drama. And she believed him completely, which was the moment she realized she was starting to be afraid. Not of him, but of how quickly she was beginning to trust him. She started watching more carefully after that. Not suspiciously. She wasn't suspicious exactly, but she started paying attention in a way she hadn't let herself do in years, because paying attention to a person meant having opinions about them, and having opinions about them meant exposure, and exposure was something she'd learned to be careful about. She'd been married once, briefly, a mistake she'd been young enough and foolish enough to make despite every instinct she'd had screaming otherwise. His name didn't matter anymore. She'd removed it from her vocabulary the same methodical way she'd removed him from her life, after discovering that the warmth he'd shown her during the courtship had been a performance, and that the man underneath it was interested only in the trading routes she'd inherited from her father. Since then, the men who had approached her had been variants of the same type, interested in her wealth, or interested in the challenge of her reputation, or interested in the idea of her, the story of the self-made frontier baroness, without being particularly interested in the actual person. Lucien showed none of those interests. He didn't flatter her. He disagreed with her twice in the first week, directly and without apology, once about the pricing on the lumber contracts, once about the placement of a guard post, and he was right both times, which she acknowledged without resentment because she was too practical to care about being right more than she cared about things working correctly. He didn't ask her about her wealth or her businesses except in the context of whatever problem he was currently trying to solve. He didn't look at the manner with the particular expression she'd learned to read in men who were calculating how much it was all worth. He looked at the North Gate gap in the caravan schedule and the feed storage system, the way someone looks at a machine they're trying to understand because they want to make it run better, not because they want to own it. She found him one evening in the records room going through the shipping manifests from the previous year. He'd asked permission first, sent a note through Mrs. Aldrich, and she'd said yes, mostly curious what he was looking for. When she came to check, she found him with 3 ledgers open simultaneously, a piece of paper beside him covered in columns of figures. "You're running a loss on the Eastern Textile route," he said without looking up. "I know." "You're running it deliberately. Why?" She sat down across from him. "Because 3 villages along that route depend on the market access. If I pull the route, they lose their main buyer. I can absorb the loss." He looked up then, and for a moment she couldn't read his expression. That's not in your interest as a businesswoman. No, she agreed. It isn't. He looked back at the ledger. It makes you one of the only merchants who runs the eastern route at all, which means you have leverage there that no one else does, which means that in 3 to 5 years, when those villages grow enough to increase their output, you'll be their only established trade partner. He picked up his pen and added a column. You're playing a long game. The long game is usually the only one worth playing. He was quiet for a moment, writing. Then he said, How long have you been running this manor? 12 years? Alone? Define alone. Without a partner, without someone you trust to share the weight of it. She looked at the top of his head bent over the ledger. I have staff I trust. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. She picked up the edge of one of the open ledgers, running her thumb along the pages. 12 years. He didn't push. He went back to the manifest, and she stayed and watched him work, and the kitchen clock ticked, and outside the window the northern frontier settled into another frozen night. The 10th day she found the ring. It was an accident, the kind of ordinary accident that changes things permanently. He'd been helping move crates in the warehouse and had taken off the outer shirt in the heat of the work, and when he leaned forward to take the weight of a crate, the chain around his neck swung loose from the collar of his undershirt and she saw it. A ring, heavy gold, old-fashioned, the kind of workmanship you saw in pieces that were either ancient heirlooms or imperial commission, and on the face of it, just visible for a second before he straightened and the chain swung back. A crest. She recognized the crest, not immediately. It took her the rest of the afternoon turning it over in her memory while she went about the day's business before it landed. She'd seen it twice before, once on a military dispatch that had come through the manor 3 years ago, requesting safe passage for troops heading north, and once on a document in her father's old papers, a trade agreement with an imperial military family from the central provinces, the Ashcombe crest. She went to her study and pulled her father's old correspondence files and went through them until she found the document. There it was, the same crest, and at the bottom of the page, a signature. Duke Calder Ashcombe, the father, the current or former head of the Ashcombe military line. She sat with that for a long time. The man in her east wing, helping stack crates and fixing gaps in walls and rewriting guard rotations, was wearing the Ashcombe ducal signet. Not the father, the son, Lucien Ashcombe. She'd heard the name years back in the context of frontier gossip that reached even the northern territories, a brilliant military commander, the empire's youngest, decorated in 2 frontier wars. Then, nothing. He'd disappeared from the news cycles completely, which at the time she'd filed away as either death or disgrace, because that was what happened to men in military command who stopped being talked about. Disgrace, apparently. Or something worse. She didn't confront him that evening. She wasn't ready to, and she needed to decide what to do with what she knew, or thought she knew, before she opened a conversation she couldn't take back. She lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind work its way around the corners of the manor, and thought about a man who had walked away from everything and arrived at her gate with 3 copper coins and asked for the cheapest room. She asked him the next morning, directly. He was in the south garden again, this time actually repairing the wall gap properly with mortar he'd obtained from somewhere. She walked up to him and stood until he finished the section he was working on and straightened. I saw the ring, she said. He went very still. Yesterday. In the warehouse. He didn't say anything. He looked at the wall, then back at her, and she watched something move across his face, not guilt exactly. More like the expression of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been asked to set it down before he was ready. How much do you know? He asked. Less than I'll need to, I imagine. He nodded slowly. He set down the trowel he'd been using and turned to face her fully. My name is Lucien Ashcombe. I held a ducal rank in the central provinces. I left that position 18 months ago. Why? A long pause. Because I was given an order I couldn't follow. What kind of order? His jaw tightened. The kind that would have required me to do something I couldn't live with afterward. She waited. There were families, he said. In the northern frontier settlements, not here, farther east. They'd been accused of harboring resistance sympathizers. The accusation was political. The families were not fighters, they were farmers, tradespeople. His voice was even, flat in the way that things go flat when the feeling underneath them is too large to let through. I was ordered to make an example. And you refused. I refused. He stopped. I made certain the families were warned before anyone arrived, which meant that by the time the order was followed by someone else, the families were gone. He looked at the wall. That wasn't forgiven. So you ran. I resigned my title formally and left. Running implies panic. He paused. I was panicking, but I did it with paperwork. She looked at him for a long moment. You gave up a dukedom. I gave up something that was already gone. You can't hold a title and refuse to be what the title requires you to be. At some point, you're just wearing a name that doesn't fit anymore. Where were you trying to go when you arrived here? He shook his head slightly. Somewhere far enough that it didn't matter who I'd been. And is this far enough? He looked at her. I hadn't planned to stay anywhere. You've been here 11 days. Yes. You reorganized my warehouse and saved my caravan and rewrote my guard rotations. There were gaps. There are always gaps. She picked up the trowel from where he'd set it and turned it in her hands. I need you to understand something. Whatever you were, you're here now, and what happens here is my concern. If there are people looking for you, there will be. Then I need to know that. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his face before. Not just tiredness. Something more like the particular grief of someone who'd learned not to expect anyone to say what she'd just said. You should send me away, he said. I'll bring you trouble. Eventually, it's not a question. I know. Evelyn, I know, she said again, steadier. But I've been dealing with trouble for 12 years, and I find I'm better at it than most. She handed him back the trowel. Fix the wall. Then come find me before noon. I need someone to go over the spring caravan contracts with me, and you'll see things in them I won't. He took the trowel. She walked back toward the house and didn't look back, because looking back would have shown him too much. But she felt him watching, and she let herself feel it for exactly 3 steps before she put it away somewhere safe and went back to work. The month that followed was the most productive Silverheart Manor had seen in years. It wasn't because Lucian took over. He didn't. He had a specific quality she'd never encountered in anyone who worked for her before, which was the ability to make things better without making them his. He'd solve a problem and step back, and the people who'd watched him solve it would own the solution themselves and feel good about it. The caravan losses dropped sharply. The warehouse turnover improved. 3 merchants who had stopped routing through Silverheart over the previous 2 years came back, one of them saying, frankly, that he didn't know what had changed, but the operation felt tighter, more reliable. She knew what had changed. What she didn't know yet was that the magistrate was already on his way. That someone, somewhere in the Imperial Administrative Network, had figured out where the disappeared Duke Ashcombe had gone to ground. That the order had been signed, and the writ prepared and the soldiers assigned, and that what was coming for Lucienne Ashcombe was also coming, with perfect and indifferent precision, for everything she'd spent 12 years building. She wouldn't know that for another 9 days, but on a frozen evening near the end of that month, she walked through the south garden past the repaired wall and found herself thinking that the man who had arrived with 3 copper coins and asked for the cheapest room had filled up the space he occupied more fully than anyone she'd ever let close enough to matter. She kept walking. She went inside. She went back to work. Neither of them had said anything yet that couldn't be unsaid, but the things that hadn't been said were starting to take up more space than the things that had. And Eveline Hawthorne, who had built a fortune on reading situations accurately, knew what that meant. She just wasn't ready to name it yet. The wall held. That was what Evelyn noticed first on the morning after she'd handed him back the trowel and walked away. The repaired section of the south garden wall was solid, the mortar set clean and flush, and the gap that had been letting cold air into the near stable was gone. Such a small thing. She'd had that gap on a list for 2 seasons, and it had stayed on the list because there was always something larger demanding attention, and he'd simply fixed it because the horses were restless and he couldn't sleep. She didn't tell him she'd noticed, but she stopped listing it in her head among the things that needed doing, and that absence took up its own kind of space. The dynamic between them had shifted after the morning she'd said his name out loud. Not his borrowed name, the stripped-down Lucian he'd been moving through the world with, but the full weight of it, Ashcombe, with everything that name carried. He hadn't relaxed exactly. She wasn't sure he knew how to relax, or whether that capacity had been trained out of him over years of being the person in every room who had to stay alert so that other people didn't have to. But something in how he occupied the manor changed, became slightly less provisional, like a man who had expected to be asked to leave and was still surprised each morning that he hadn't been. She gave him access to the full records room 2 days after their conversation in the garden. Not formally, she just left the key on the work table in the warehouse where he'd been reorganizing the inventory system, with a note that said only, "Manifests from the last 5 years are on the east shelf. The eastern route numbers are worse than I told you." He came to find her that evening in her study with 3 pages of handwritten notes and the look of a man who had spent the day doing something that reminded him what his mind was for. "You're running 6 routes at a deficit," he said, setting the pages on her desk without preamble. "I know, I told you about the eastern route specifically. I mean 6 total. The eastern route is the most visible one. The other 5 are slower bleeds. You won't see them become critical for another 2-3 years. But they're bleeding now." He sat down across from her, which he hadn't done before without being invited. She noticed that too. "Can I show you?" She pushed her own work aside and looked at his notes. He'd reorganized her numbers in a way she hadn't thought to look at them, not by route but by season, showing which losses were weather-dependent and which were structural, which could be corrected by timing, and which were going to require changing how she contracted with her suppliers. His handwriting was precise and small and moved fast across the page. She could see the thinking in it, the way the columns weren't just reporting the problem, but already moving toward what to do about it. "You went to school for this," she said, though it wasn't a question. "Military command has a significant administrative component. You learn to read supply chains and logistics whether you want to or not." He pointed to the 3rd column on the 2nd page. "Your problem on the river route isn't the route itself, it's the barge contractor. He's overcharging for winter weight loads, and you've been absorbing it because switching contractors mid-season costs more in delay than the overcharge does." "Yes, but you haven't renegotiated at the end of season." "He's the only reliable barge operator on the North River." "He was the only reliable operator. There's a family that started running cargo out of Mill Haven 2 years ago. They're smaller, but they're consistent. I talked to 2 of your warehouse men who've seen their operation." He paused. "I talked to them yesterday. I hope that wasn't overstepping." She looked at him. "You've been here less than 2 weeks." "I know. You've talked to my warehouse staff, reorganized my manifest system, rewrote the guard rotation, improved the stable operations, and are now renegotiating my barge contracts." A beat. "I haven't renegotiated anything. I'm suggesting you might want to." "Lucien." He waited. "I'm not complaining," she said. He let out a breath that was almost but not quite a laugh. "I don't know how to be in a place without trying to fix what's broken. It's a problem. Most people's problems are significantly worse." She looked back at his notes. "Tell me about the Millhaven operation." They worked until the kitchen clock struck 11, which was later than she usually stayed up, and almost certainly later than he'd planned on either. Mrs. Aldrich appeared in the doorway at 10:30 to raise an eyebrow at the empty coffee pot and receive an absent wave from her employer that meant bring another one. The second pot was finished before they were done. When he finally stood to leave, he gathered his notes and paused at the door. "Evelyn." She looked up. "I understand what it costs to trust someone," he said. "I mean that. I'm not—" He stopped, rearranged whatever he'd been about to say. "I'm aware that what you're giving me, letting me into the workings of this place, isn't a small thing. I want you to know I understand that." She held his gaze. "Are you telling me not to trust you?" "No." He said it quietly but without hesitation. "I'm telling you that I know what it's worth." She nodded once. He left. She sat with the empty coffee pot and his handwritten pages spread across her desk and thought that this was either the most sensible thing she'd done in years or a mistake so large she wouldn't see the shape of it until it was too late. She gathered his notes, put them in the file she'd started for the barge contractor problem, and went to bed. Gimtum. The thing about a place like Silver Heart was that it didn't keep secrets well, not from the inside. 50 people worked the manor and its immediate operations on a daily basis, and 50 people meant 50 sets of observations and 50 different conversations over meals and in corridors, and the collective awareness of those 50 people was remarkably precise. They had noticed Lucien before Eveline had finished her first coffee with him in the kitchen. The conclusions they drew were varied. Sana, the cook, had decided within 48 hours that he was a disgraced noble of some kind, and that Eveline was taking him in out of a combination of charity and interest, the latter of which Sana considered overdue and entirely appropriate. Breck's assessment was more cautious. He told the 2 gate guards he most trusted that the man had military training at a level that went well beyond what anyone called a trade company security officer, and that they should watch how he moved because it would tell them something. The stablemaster, a man of few words named Tomas, had stopped caring about Lucian's background entirely by day 4 because the man had shown him a method for distributing morning feed that cut 20 minutes off the daily schedule. And as far as Tomas was concerned, that bought a man considerable goodwill. What they agreed on, all 50 of them across the various theories and assessments, was that whatever Lucien was or had been, he was doing something for the manor that they couldn't quite articulate but could feel. Things ran better. Not because he'd taken over, he was careful, almost deliberate about not taking over. But he had a quality that was difficult to name, some combination of competence and attention that made the people around him sharper without making them feel diminished. The warehouse workers started solving problems themselves that they'd previously brought to the foreman, because Lucien had spent 3 days asking them questions about how things worked rather than telling them how to do things differently. And in the process of answering his questions, they'd figured out answers they hadn't known they had. One of the younger gate guards came to Breck at the end of the second week and asked, somewhat awkwardly, if there was a way to get more of whatever Mr. Lucien had done with the watch rotation explained, because he'd been looking at the chart and wanted to understand the thinking behind it, not just follow the schedule. Breck reported this to Eveline with a complicated expression. The boy wants to understand strategy, she said. The boy has been here 2 years and never asked to understand anything that wasn't directly in his job description. Breck paused. Your East Wing guest is teaching people to think. Is that a problem? Breck thought about it. No, he said, slightly surprised to arrive at that answer. It's not a problem. It's just not what I expected. What did you expect? Trouble, eventually. Give it time, Eveline said, which turned out to be more accurate than she'd meant it to be. The second caravan incident was different from the first. The first had been bandits, brutal, predictable, solvable, with clear thinking and nerve. The second was something slower and uglier, the kind of problem that didn't announce itself in an ambush on a daylight road, but instead arrived in paperwork. A merchant named Dorval, who controlled a significant share of the Valley trading licenses, had been systematically shorting the weights on his delivery confirmations to Silverheart for 2 seasons. The discrepancy was small enough, per transaction, to look like clerical variation. Accumulated over 18 months, it added up to something that crossed the line from error into fraud. Lucien found it in the manifest. He found it the way he found most things, quietly, late at night in the records room, cross-referencing delivery weights against the original order documents with the specific patience of someone who had done this kind of analysis before, in contexts where the stakes were considerably higher than trading contracts. He brought it to Eveline on a Tuesday morning with 4 pages of annotated records and said, Dorval has been stealing from you. She took the pages, read through them. The numbers were clear once you saw what to look for, and she could follow his methodology precisely enough to verify it herself if she'd wanted to. She didn't need to. The work was clean. How long did this take you? She asked. 3 evenings. She set down the pages. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. All right. Were you looking for this specifically, or did you find it by accident? He met her eyes. I was looking for gaps. I wasn't looking for this specifically, but once I saw the pattern in the weight records, I followed it. You always follow the gaps. Yes, it's difficult to stop. She looked at the annotated pages again, the handwriting at the margins, his notes to himself about what matched and what didn't, the columns of figures with small marks indicating discrepancies. He'd color-coded it, she noticed. Not elaborately, just two different inks, one for confirmed discrepancy and one for probable. The level of care in it was significant. Dorval has 3 magistrate friends, she said. I know. I asked Breck about his connections. If I move against him directly, he'll use those connections to complicate my licenses. Yes. Lucian leaned forward slightly. Which is why you don't move against him directly. You bring it to the Merchant Council as a weight standard complaint. Neutral, administrative, not personal. The council has its own investigators, and if they're the ones who find the discrepancy, Dorval can't direct his friends at you specifically, because it's not you making the accusation. She looked at him. How do you know about the Merchant Council's investigative process? A pause. I've spent 2 weeks talking to your warehouse staff and your trading partners. People tell you a great deal if you ask them what they think about things. You've been building a map of how this valley's commercial relationships work. I've been trying to understand where you operate and what the dynamics are. That's the same thing. He didn't argue that. She stood up and went to the window, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, 2 of the stable boys were crossing the yard in the thin winter sunlight, one of them telling the other something that made them both laugh. Small and ordinary. The kind of moment that only existed because the place around it was functioning. Why? She asked, not turning around. Why what? Why does it matter to you? She turned then. You're not a partner here. You're not an investor. You have no stake in whether my routes run well or Dorval is charging me properly. You could spend your time here keeping your head down, staying out of sight, waiting for whatever you're waiting for. He was quiet for longer than she expected. Because it's here, he said finally, and it needs doing. And He paused, and what crossed his face then was something unguarded enough that she made herself look away, because it felt private. I spent 2 years commanding things that I could see were wrong and telling myself it was the position that mattered, the duty of the role, the necessity. I followed things I shouldn't have followed, and I stopped short of following one thing I absolutely couldn't follow, and I walked away. And when I walked away, I didn't know what was left. He looked at his hands. Apparently what's left is someone who notices gaps. She turned back to the window. I'll take it to the Merchant Council, she said. Your approach is correct. She heard him gather the papers. Evelyn, his voice was careful. For what it's worth, the work here, what you've built, it's genuinely good. The Eastern Route subsidy, the way you run the manor, there are people in this valley who depend on those decisions being made the way you make them. That matters. She kept looking out the window. Don't do that. What? Tell me the work is good. I'll start believing it and get careless. A short silence, then quietly. I don't think careless is in your range. She allowed herself a small private expression that he couldn't see from where he was standing. Get out of my study, Lucian. I have a letter to write to the Merchant Council. She heard him leave, heard the door close, and stood there a moment longer with the winter sunlight thin and honest on the yard below, and the awareness that whatever she'd been managing to keep at a controlled distance was getting harder to manage. Quote, the letter to the Merchant Council worked. It worked better and faster than she'd expected because it turned out that 2 other merchants in the valley had been experiencing similar weight discrepancies with Dorval's operation and hadn't been able to find the pattern clearly enough to bring a complaint. Eveline's documentation, Lucian's documentation, presented under her name, gave the investigators a framework precise enough to apply across multiple cases, and within 3 weeks, Dorval was facing a formal council review that had nothing to do with Evelyn Hawthorne personally and everything to do with his own consistent dishonesty. His magistrate friends couldn't redirect what they couldn't clearly target. This was, Evelyn understood, a demonstration of something she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. Not just intelligence, but a particular kind of intelligence that understood systems and how to move within them without becoming a target. The kind that took years to develop and a specific kind of environment to develop in. She asked him, directly, one evening when they were reviewing the spring contracts, "What rank did you hold?" He looked up from the contract he was reading. "Military rank," she said. "What was it?" "Does it matter at this point?" "I'm curious." He set down the contract. "Field Marshal, before I resigned." She absorbed this. Field Marshal was not a minor military posting. It was not the kind of rank you held if you were good at organizing things and following orders. It was the kind of rank you held if you were the person other people deferred to in rooms full of people who deferred to almost no one. You were the Empire's youngest military commander, she said. She'd put that together from memory weeks ago, but hadn't said it until now. Third youngest, historical record matters. And you walked away from that. And I walked away from that. She looked at him. He was sitting across her desk in the lamplight, 40 years old, give or take, wearing a borrowed house shirt that had been laundered enough times to be soft, with his dark hair slightly too long and a scar along his left forearm that she'd noticed weeks ago and never asked about. Former Field Marshal. Former Duke. Currently working her manifest files at 9 in the evening for no compensation beyond the room and the meals. Are you going to keep being an enigma about this, or are you going to tell me what actually happened? She asked. He considered her for a moment. I told you the essential facts. You told me there were families and an order you couldn't follow. That's not the same as the whole picture. No, he agreed. It isn't. He looked at the contract in front of him, then back at her. There were 312 people. I counted them. That's what the intelligence report said. 312 individuals in 6 settlements along the Eastern Ridge, accused of harboring political dissidents. He said it the way people say things they've said over and over in their own heads until the words are worn smooth and separate from the feeling. The accusation came from a governor who wanted the land those settlements were on. The land had mineral deposits. The dissidents were 3 people, 2 of whom turned out to have been dead for a year before the accusation was filed. Evelyn was quiet. I refused the order on the grounds that it was predicated on false intelligence. My superior told me the intelligence didn't matter, that the strategic objective was the land clearance and the political accusation was the mechanism. He paused. I asked for the order in writing. He gave it to me. I had my adjutant copy the order 3 times and deliver the copies to 3 separate locations before I sent the warning to the settlements. He looked at his hands. I kept the original. You kept the order. It's in the bottom of that canvas sack that came with me. She stared at him. You've been walking around the northern frontier with a document that could destroy a senior imperial commander. And a ducal signet ring, apparently. Lucien, I know. He rubbed a hand across his face, and for a moment he looked less like a former field marshal and more like a man who was very tired in a way that sleep didn't fully address. I've known for 18 months that it's not safe to carry. I've also known that it's the only record that exists of what that order was and who gave it, and that if I destroy it, the 312 people those families knew nothing about cease to matter in any official capacity. So you've been carrying it anyway. I've been carrying it anyway. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was something she almost never did in front of anyone because it was a posture of thinking and she didn't like people watching her think. There are people looking for you, she said. Yes. Not just disgraced Duke, let's bring him back and reinstate him, actually looking. The governor whose order I refused is now a Lord Protector with 4 times the political influence he had 18 months ago. He has reasons to want that document recovered and reasons to want me unable to testify about what happened on the Eastern Ridge. He said it matter-of-factly, like a man describing weather patterns. So yes, people are looking. She brought her eyes back down to him. When do you think they'll get here? Something in his expression shifted, and she realized that he was surprised, not by the information, but by the question, by the fact that she'd asked when they'll get here, rather than how quickly can you leave. I don't know, he said. It's been quiet. Either they lost the trail or they're being patient. Patient is worse. Yes, he said quietly. Patient is worse. She pulled the spring contracts back in front of her. All right, then we'll deal with it when it arrives. In the meantime, there are 2 clauses in the Harwick timber contract that I believe are structured to give them an exit option if prices rise, and I'd like you to look at whether that's what they actually say or whether I'm reading it wrong. He stared at her. The contract, she said. He picked up the contract. She could feel him looking at her over the top of it. You're not going to ask me to leave, he said. I'm going to ask you to read the Harwick contract. Evelyn. Lucienne. She met his eyes. I have been running this estate for 12 years. I have dealt with fraudulent merchants and corrupt licensing officials and 2 separate attempts by men who thought my being a woman meant my business was available for acquisition. I am not going to be destroyed by something that arrives and can be prepared for. She paused. Now, read the contract before I change my mind about the entirety of this situation. He read the contract. The timber clause was, in fact, structured exactly as she'd suspected. They worked until midnight, and when he finally left the study, she sat alone with the lamp burning low and the documents spread across her desk and thought about 312 people in 6 settlements, and a man who had counted them and kept the order that would have killed them, and was now sitting in her manor, reviewing timber contracts and fixing gaps in garden walls. She thought about all of it for a long time. Then she put the lamp out and went to bed, because tomorrow the river barge contractor was coming to renegotiate his rates, and she needed to be sharp. And being sharp required sleep, and she had learned long ago that the problems that were still there in the morning were the only ones worth losing sleep over. The barge negotiation went exactly as Lucienne had predicted it would, which was to say that it went in Evelyn's favor decisively and left the contractor visibly wrong-footed because he'd arrived expecting to negotiate with a woman who didn't fully understand her own leverage and instead found himself across the table from a woman who had been briefed precisely on the existence of the Millhaven alternative and was willing to use it. She got the rate reduction she needed. The contractor agreed to a seasonal renegotiation clause that would prevent future overcharges from accumulating unnoticed. Lucienne was not in the room for the negotiation. She hadn't asked him to be, and he hadn't offered. But when it was done and she passed through the warehouse on her way back, he looked up from what he was doing and raised an eyebrow. Done, she said. Good terms? Better than good? He blinked first. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. He would. You seemed very certain of that. He's been profiting from your patience for 2 years. The moment you stopped being patient, there was nowhere for him to go. He turned back to the inventory he'd been working on. You should have done it a year ago. I didn't have the Millhaven alternative a year ago. Fair. She watched him work for a moment. You were right about the weight distribution on the second shelf too, by the way. Tomas tested it this morning, and we gained an additional 40 weight capacity. Good. You never... She stopped. He looked up. Never what? She shook her head slightly. Nothing. You were going to say something. You never seemed to need to hear that you were right, she said. Most people need to hear it. You don't. He held her gaze for a moment. I spent years in positions where whether I was right or not wasn't the point. The point was whether the outcome was correct. He paused. I got used to measuring by outcomes. And the outcome here is correct. So far. She walked away through the warehouse, between the reorganized shelves and the relabeled crates and the improved weight distribution, and thought that this was what it looked like when someone was genuinely good at something, not performing competence, but actually possessing it in the unstated, unselfconscious way that made it look like breathing. The letter arrived on a Thursday, and Breck brought it to her before she'd finished her morning coffee. He didn't say anything when he handed it over. He didn't have to. The seal on the outside told her what she needed to know before she opened it, an administrative seal, not military, which was either better or worse than military depending on what was inside, and which she'd half been expecting for the past 2 weeks without letting herself think about it directly. She read it once, carefully, then read it again. It was a formal notice from the Imperial Provincial Office, citing her trading licenses for review under a provision that related to known associations with individuals under Imperial Administrative Warrant. The language was bureaucratic and careful and said almost nothing directly while implying everything. It was signed by a deputy administrator she'd never heard of, which meant someone with more authority had wanted their name kept off the document. She folded it and put it in her desk drawer. Then she got up, found Lucien in the records room where he spent most mornings, and set the folded letter on the table in front of him. He read it. His face did not change appreciably, but she had been watching his face long enough now to read the small things, the slight tightening at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes moved through the text a second time, slower. They found me, he said. They found you. They're coming through the licenses because it's slower but cleaner than sending soldiers directly. It lets them create a paper basis for taking the estate if they want to use it later. He set the letter down. I should leave. I know you think that. Evelyn, I know you think that, she repeated, and I understand why. And I need you to hear me when I tell you that leaving is not the correct tactical response to this particular threat. She sat down across from him. Sit down, Lucien. We have work to do. He sat. Not easily, but he sat. The license review is administrative, she said, which means it can be challenged through administrative channels. I have a trade lawyer in the Valley who has beaten the provincial office twice in the past 8 years. I also have relationships with 4 members of the Merchant Council who do not like it when the provincial office oversteps into trade regulation because it sets a precedent that threatens their own licenses. They'll escalate beyond administrative if that fails. Yes, and we'll deal with that when it happens. She looked at him steadily. You told me the families. You told me about the order. You told me about the document in your bag. I am going to ask you now whether there is anything else, any other piece of this that I need to know before we decide how to respond. He was quiet for a moment. The Lord Protector who gave the order has a cousin in the provincial administrative office. Which cousin? Deputy Administrator Corvain. She reached for the folded letter, opened it again, looked at the signature. Deputy Administrator Corvain, the man whose name was the only name on the document. Well, she said after a moment, that explains the timing. They've been waiting for me to get comfortable somewhere, and you have. He looked at her. Yes. She folded the letter again, precise and deliberate. Then we're going to make them regret their patience. She stood up. I need the last 3 years of my licensing documentation pulled and organized by category. Start with the trade route authorizations. He stood too. You don't have to do this. I know. Evelyn. His voice caught on her name in a way it hadn't before, and she felt the weight of it. I know what I'm bringing to your door. She met his eyes and held them, and what she said next she said carefully, because she meant it precisely, and not more than precisely. Get the licensing documentation, she said. I'll write to my lawyer. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the shelves and started pulling files, and she walked back to her study to write the most important letter she'd composed in 12 years. And neither of them said what was actually happening in that room, because some things are too fragile to name before you're certain they can hold the weight. The lawyer's name was Holt Mercer, and he arrived at Silverheart 3 days after Evelyn's letter reached him, which told her he understood the urgency without her having to spell it out. He was a small man, compact and precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away in a room full of people trying to read it. He'd been practicing trade law in the Valley for 22 years and had the particular quality of a man who had lost enough cases early in his career to understand exactly what losing felt like, and had therefore become very good at not losing. He read the provincial office letter at Evelyn's desk while she stood by the window, and Lucien sat in the corner chair with his arms crossed and said nothing. Mercer read it twice, set it down, picked it up, and read the signature again. Corvain, he said. Yes. He's been in that office for 8 months, appointed by the Lord Protector's Administrative Council. Mercer set the letter down with the careful precision of a man placing a piece on a board. This isn't a routine license review. I know what it is. Then you know that the provision they're citing, known associations, is broad enough to be applied to almost any commercial relationship if they want to stretch it. He glanced at Lucien briefly, the way a man glances at a situation he's already incorporated into his thinking. The question is how hard they intend to push it. Hard enough to send it through Corvain rather than a standard administrative channel, Evelyn said, which means they want it done quietly and they want it done with paper behind it before they move to anything more direct. Mercer folded his hands on the desk. All right, here's where we are. Your licenses are clean. I know because I filed most of them. The review provision they're using requires a specific procedural pathway that takes, at minimum, 45 days if challenged immediately and correctly. If we challenge on day 1, today, we push the timeline out and force them to produce specific evidence of the association they're citing, which means naming your guest formally and publicly. Which they won't want to do, Lucien said from the corner. Mercer looked at him. No. Because the moment it's formal and public, it's visible to more than just the provincial office. And visibility is what they've been trying to avoid. He paused. You're Ashcombe. Lucien said nothing. I've been in Valley trade law long enough to know what a Lord Protector's administrative apparatus looks like when it's hunting something it doesn't want found in public. He turned back to Evelyn. I need 3 days to file the challenge. Can you keep things quiet here for 3 days? I've kept things quiet here for 30 years, Evelyn said. Mercer allowed himself the smallest possible smile. Then let's get to work, us. The 3 days were not quiet, not externally. Externally, Silverheart continued to operate with its usual rhythm, the caravans going out and coming back, the warehouse turning inventory, the morning kitchen producing breakfast for 50 people, and the evening kitchen producing supper. Mercer worked in the guest room Evelyn had set up as a temporary office, emerging periodically to ask for specific documents that Lucien pulled from the filing system with the efficiency of a man who had spent weeks learning exactly where everything was. But internally, something had shifted in the texture of the place. The staff knew something was happening. 50 people in close proximity to each other and to their employer don't miss the arrival of a trade lawyer carrying a briefcase and the expression of a man preparing for a fight. They knew without being told that the provincial office letter had something to do with it, because Breck knew, and Breck had told Tomas, and Tomas had told Sana, and Sana had told everyone else while producing supper on the first evening. What surprised Evelyn when she became aware of this chain of information was the response. Sana came to her on the second morning and said, without preamble, "The staff wants to know if there's anything we can do." Evelyn looked up from the document she was reviewing. Do about what? Sana gave her a look that suggested she was not fooling anyone. About whatever's coming, the license business. That's being handled by Mr. Mercer. I know, but the boys in the warehouse were talking last night, and 2 of the gate guards came and asked Breck if there was a way to help. She crossed her arms. People here don't forget that you ran the Eastern textile route at a loss for 3 years, so the Valley Market stayed open. They notice things like that. They're asking what they can do. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Tell them to do their jobs well, she said. That's what helps. Sana left, apparently satisfied with this answer, though it wasn't quite the answer she'd been looking for. But the following day, without any instruction from Evelyn, 3 of the warehouse workers spent their off hours reorganizing the emergency documentation storage in the basement, fireproofing the boxes, creating a second set of copies for the most important records, because one of them had said to the others that if the provincial office came to confiscate things, the copies would be harder to find. Evelyn found out about this from Breck and said nothing, but went down to the basement that evening to look at what they'd done, and stood there for a moment in the cold with the neat rows of fireproof boxes and felt something she didn't have an easy word for. Lucien found her there. He'd been looking for her to review a document Mercer needed, and someone had pointed him toward the basement stairs. He stood in the doorway and took in the organized boxes and her expression. They did this themselves, he said. Yes. You didn't ask them to. No. He looked at the boxes. She watched him take in what they represented, not just the labor of it, but the decision behind it. 50 people who had decided independently that what happened to this place mattered to them. You built something real, he said. I built something that works. She turned away from the boxes. Let's go look at Mercer's document. He followed her up the stairs, and she was grateful he didn't say anything more about it, because she was already dangerously close to feeling things she needed to stay practical about. Mercer filed the challenge on day 3, and the provincial office received it on day 5, and on day 7, 2 men arrived at Silverheart's front gate who were not merchants and were not travelers. They came in the middle of the afternoon, which was either a sign they were confident or a sign they were amateurs, and Breck, who assessed people at the gate for a living, concluded within 30 seconds that they were neither amateur nor confident, but something more specific, professional and careful, and there to look rather than to act. He sent word to Evelyn, who came to the gate herself and looked at the men without any particular expression. They showed her a document, provincial office authorization for a site inspection related to the license review. My lawyer has challenged the review, she said pleasantly. Do you have documentation that the challenge has been processed and denied? They did not. Then I'll ask you to come back when you do. She looked at the document again, then handed it back. Mr. Breck will give you a receipt confirming that you presented this authorization today, which will be useful for your records. Good afternoon. She walked back inside before they could formulate a response. Mercer, who had watched from the window, said when she came back in, "That bought us time. They'll be back." "I know. Probably with something harder to decline." "I know that too." She sat down. "How long do we have?" "Weeks, maybe, if they want to do this properly. Days, if someone above Corvain decides to stop being patient." She thought about what Lucien had said. Patient is worse. She was beginning to understand what he meant in a new and concrete way. "All right," she said. "Then we use the weeks." What she did with the weeks was methodical and unglamorous, and exactly the kind of work that looked like nothing from the outside but built into something that couldn't be easily dismantled. She contacted every merchant who held a Silver Heart trading relationship, 47 of them across the valley and the frontier territories. Not asking for help directly, asking for confirmation of their trading histories, for documentation of their own licensing, for statements of commercial record that would, collectively, create a picture of a well-run operation with 47 sets of corroborating witnesses. 39 responded within a week, 6 more the week after. 2 didn't respond, which told her something useful about those 2 relationships going forward. Lucien organized the incoming documentation with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. He had a system set up in the records room within 2 days, incoming letters sorted by trading partner, cross-referenced against the original license filings, flagged for anything that strengthened or complicated Mercer's challenge. He worked 12-hour days without being asked to, and he never once suggested that any of this was particularly heroic or difficult. It was work that needed doing. He did it. But there were cracks, and she saw them. She came to the records room late on the 9th evening and found him sitting very still at the table with a document in front of him that he wasn't reading. He was just looking at it. His hands were flat on the table, and his face had the expression she'd been learning to recognize, the one that meant he'd been somewhere else in his head for longer than he'd intended. She sat down across from him and didn't say anything. He came back slowly, looked at her, looked at the document. "I'm sorry. I lost focus." "What are you thinking about?" A pause. He looked at the document again, and she saw what it was. One of the letters from a valley merchant, nothing remarkable. He'd been staring at a perfectly ordinary trading confirmation and gone somewhere very far away from it. "I'm thinking about the fact that 41 merchants responded to your letter," he said, "in less than 2 weeks, without being told why specifically, without being promised anything. They responded because their commercial interests align with some of them, yes." He looked at her. "Not all of them. The Ashford family? They're 3 days out, and their route doesn't depend on your Eastern licenses. They responded because of you." He paused. "I commanded 11,000 men at my peak. I could order a hill taken, and it would be taken. I could redraw a supply line, and 300 people would change how they spent their days." He said it without pride, just fact. "But I never had 41 people write letters on my behalf because they wanted to." She looked at him across the table. "You made them want to because you were ordering them." "Yes." "It's different." "Yes," he said again quietly. "It's very different." She held his gaze. "The 312 families, you didn't order them to matter to you?" Something moved in his face that was difficult to look at directly. "No." "So you do know what it feels like. You just haven't—" She stopped, chose her words more carefully. "You've been measuring by outcomes for so long that you forgot the difference between the outcome and the thing that makes it worth having." He didn't answer immediately. The lamp on the table between them burned without flickering, and the manor was quiet around them in the particular way of a large house at 10 in the evening, settling into itself. "I warned you I would bring trouble," he said. "You did." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry about it," she said. "Be useful. I have 15 more letters to review before morning, and you read faster than I do." He pulled the stack of letters toward himself. They worked in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence, the silence of 2 people who had found a rhythm with each other and didn't need to fill it. Outside, the northern wind was doing what it always did, and inside the lamp burned and the letters got reviewed, and neither of them said what was accumulating in the space between them, because there was work to do, and the work was what held everything together. The men came back on the 14th day, not the two careful professional men from the first visit. This time it was Magistrate Allin, the same magistrate who had walked through Evelyn's front door 3 weeks later in the opening of this story, though at this point he was arriving for the second time, and he came with 6 soldiers and a new document that had been signed at a level above Deputy Administrator Corvain. Evelyn met him in the reception hall, and this time she let Lucien stand beside her, because there was no longer any point in maintaining the fiction of his invisibility. Allin looked at Lucien once, with the brief assessment of a man confirming something he already knew, then handed Evelyn the document. New authorization. Supersedes the challenge filed by your lawyer. She took it, read it carefully. This cites an imperial security provision. Correct. That provision applies to active military threats. Mr. She paused. My guest is not an active military threat. That determination has been made at the imperial level, Lady Hawthorne, and is not subject to local challenge. He had the flat certainty of a man reading from a script he'd been given, which told her that he was not actually confident about the authority of his document, but had been instructed to present as though he was. I'm here to conduct a formal search of the premises and to deliver a summons for the individual known as Lucien Ashcombe to present himself to the Provincial Administrative Court within 5 days. Lucien said, very calmly, Under what specific statute? Allin looked at him. The summons is, Under what specific statute has the imperial security provision been applied? Lucien's voice hadn't changed in tone or volume. It was the same voice he used in the warehouse. But something underneath it was different, and Allin noticed it the same way the bandits on the road had noticed what was in his direction when he'd ridden toward them openly. The provision has 4 subsections. Which one? A beat. The documentation specifies. The documentation you're holding doesn't specify, because I can read the header from here and the authorization block is incomplete. He stepped forward slightly. I want to be clear about something. I'm not refusing to cooperate with legitimate legal process. I'm asking you specifically to produce the complete statutory basis for the action you're attempting to take. That's not obstruction. That's a legal right that exists regardless of who's asking. Allin's expression had developed a new quality, not quite uncertainty, more like a man who had expected to walk into a room and found the room rearranged. I'll need to obtain the complete documentation from the administrative office, he said. Then I suggest you do that, Lucien said. Lady Hawthorne is happy to cooperate with any legally complete process the administrative office produces. In the meantime, the search authorization in that document is contingent on the security provision being validly applied, and until the statutory basis is confirmed, she is within her rights to decline the search. Allin looked at Evelyn. She gave him the expression she used for merchant negotiations when she knew she had the stronger position. Polite, unhurried. Mr. Mercer's office is in the valley, if you need to consult regarding the complete process. He's been helpful in explaining procedural requirements. Allin took his document and his 6 soldiers and left. In the silence after the front doors closed, Mrs. Aldrich appeared from the corridor where she had been, quite obviously, listening. She looked at Lucien with the expression of a woman recalibrating her estimates significantly upward, then disappeared back into the corridor without a word. Breck, who had watched from the corner, said, He'll be back with the complete documentation. Yes, Lucien said, and it'll be right next time. Probably. How long did we just buy? Lucien considered. 3 to 5 days for them to compile the full statutory basis, assuming Corvain moves immediately. A day or 2 to get it back here. He looked at Evelyn. A week, maybe slightly more. Enough time, she said. For what? For what I should have done 6 days ago. She turned toward her study. I need to send a letter to Lord Harwick. Both Lucien and Breck looked at her. Harwick controls the Northern Frontier Trade Commission, she said. He has been looking for a legitimate reason to challenge the provincial office's jurisdiction over frontier trading licenses for 3 years, because the province keeps imposing fees that eat into commission revenue. I have just been handed his reason. She paused in the doorway. Lucien, I need everything you found about the statutory conflict between provincial and commission authority and the licensing framework. It's in the blue folder on the east shelf. He went for it immediately. She watched him move, the efficiency of it, the total absence of hesitation, and felt the particular weight of what was happening settle fully onto her, not as fear, but as clarity. They were past the point where this resolved quietly. Whatever was coming would be large and loud, and would require her to be willing to spend political capital she'd been carefully conserving for years. She was going to do it anyway. She'd known she was going to do it anyway since the moment she'd read the letter with Corvain's signature. She just hadn't admitted it to herself until Lucien had stood in her front hall and said under what specific statute in a voice that belonged to a man worth standing beside. The letter to Lord Harwick went out the same evening. The response came in 2 days, which was faster than the post normally moved, which meant that someone at Harwick's end had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Mercer came back from the valley with the response and spread it on Evelyn's desk and allowed himself an expression that was close to satisfaction. Harwick is bringing a jurisdictional challenge through the Trade Commission. It doesn't directly protect your guest, that's a separate matter, but it pulls the provincial licensing action into a dispute that the administrative office cannot resolve on its own. How long does that buy? Weeks, possibly longer. The jurisdictional question is legitimately unresolved. I've been watching it accumulate for years. Harwick's people have been preparing for this. Lucien, sitting in the corner, said, "The license challenge and the summons are two separate tracks. What Evelyn just did neutralizes the license track. The summons is still active. The summons without the license action loses most of its practical leverage," Mercer said. "They can still compel your appearance through imperial process, but without the estate seizure threat attached, the pressure is significantly reduced." "Reduced isn't removed." "No," Mercer agreed. "It isn't." He paused. "There's another option, one that requires more than legal maneuvering." Lucien looked at him steadily. "The document you carried out of the Eastern Ridge," Mercer said carefully. "If it's what you've told me it is, a signed order from a Lord Protector directing what would amount to a civilian massacre, that's not a piece of private evidence. That's a matter of imperial law. The investigative branch of the Imperial Court has jurisdiction over actions taken by Lord Protectors." "The investigative branch is also politically complex," Lucien said. "Everything is politically complex. The question is whether the document is real and whether you're willing to use it." The room was quiet. Evelyn watched Lucien's face. She saw the things she'd seen before, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying weight for so long that setting it down had become harder than continuing to carry it, because setting it down meant something final, and final things were terrifying in a way that ongoing burdens weren't. "It's real," he said. "Then it needs to go to the investigative branch. Not through normal channels, through a commissioner. I know one. He's not friendly to the Lord Protector's faction, and he's been building a case against Corvain's patron for months." Lucien said nothing for a long moment. Evelyn said, "Lucien." He looked at her. "The 312, she said quietly. His jaw tightened. Then he nodded once and said, "I'll get the document. But the canvas sack had been under the east wing bed for 7 weeks by this point, which was 7 weeks longer than Lucien had intended to stay anywhere. He brought it to the study and set it on the table and opened it with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and removed from the bottom a flat oilskin packet that had been folded and refolded enough times that the creases were permanent. Inside the oilskin was a single document. 2 pages. Heavy paper, the kind used for official military correspondence. A header identifying the originating command authority. 7 paragraphs of administrative language that built toward a single operational directive. And at the bottom, a signature that Mercer looked at for a very long time without speaking. "That's Lord Protector Vale," he said finally. "Yes." "This is—" Mercer stopped, set the document down with great care. "You've been carrying this for 18 months. "Yes." "And you walked into Lady Hawthorne's estate with it under your arm." "I walked into Lady Hawthorne's estate in a snowstorm with 3 copper coins," Lucien said. The document was incidental. Mercer looked at Evelyn. She looked at the document. The careful official language and the tidy signature at the bottom. And somewhere behind those 7 paragraphs, 312 people who had been given a chance to leave before the people following orders arrived. "I'll contact Commissioner Adley tonight," Mercer said. It needs to go by private courier, not the standard post. I know, Lucian said. Once this is in the commissioner's hands, the nature of the situation changes completely. Vile's people will know it's gone. The pressure on Lady Hawthorne won't go away. It may increase in the short term. Lucienne looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him without any particular expression, though her hands, under the table, were clasped tightly enough to hurt. Send it, she said. Mercer nodded and took the document carefully, as if it were something that might break, which, in a sense, it was, and left the room to arrange the courier. In the silence that followed, Lucian said, You didn't ask me if I was sure. You've been sure for 18 months, she said. You just needed to stop running long enough to do something about it. He looked at the empty oilskin on the table. I've been here 7 weeks. 7 weeks is long enough. She stood up. Come to the kitchen. Sana made something with the river catch this morning, and she'll be offended if we don't eat. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read, the one that meant he was surprised, again, by the ordinary fact of being treated like a person who deserved supper. All right, he said. They walked to the kitchen, and Sana put plates in front of them without ceremony, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the northern frontier was doing its usual cold and indifferent thing, and neither of them talked about what had just been set in motion, because there was nothing left to say about it tonight, and the food was good, and sometimes that's what there is. Olin came back on the 6th day. He came with the complete documentation this time, the full statutory basis, correctly formatted, signed at a level above Corvain, with a commissioner's seal that Mercer looked at and said was legitimate. And he came with 12 soldiers instead of 6, which told them that someone above Corvain had lost patience with careful increments and decided to escalate. Evelyn met him at the front door again, and this time she didn't try to find procedural objections, because Mercer had told her the documentation was complete and the process was valid, and the moment had come that they'd been preparing for, and simultaneously hoping to avoid. Olin handed her the documents. The summons is binding. I'm also authorized to take temporary custody of Mr. Ashcombe pending the Provincial Administrative Court review. Lucian was standing behind her and slightly to the left. She felt, rather than saw, him shift his weight forward. Not aggressive, but prepared. He'll come willingly, she said. Evelyn, Lucian said, low and careful. She turned to him briefly, and what she said next she said quietly enough that only he could hear it. Commissioner Adley received the document 4 days ago. Mercer had confirmation this morning, trust me. Something moved across his face, complicated and unguarded for a second before he controlled it. He nodded. She turned back to Olin. He'll come willingly, she repeated. I'll come with him. Olin blinked. Lady Hawthorne, there's no requirement. I'm aware of what's required, she said. I'm also aware of what's permitted. I have commercial interests in the outcome of this process, and a legal right to be present. She picked up the coat that Mrs. Aldrich was already holding ready, because Mrs. Aldrich had been ready for 10 minutes. Shall we? Olin had the expression of a man who had been briefed on Lady Evelyn Hawthorne, but had clearly not quite believed it until this moment. He stepped back from the door. She walked out first, into the cold northern air and the afternoon winter light, with 12 soldiers and a magistrate waiting in her yard, and 47 merchant letters filed in her records room, and a trade commission jurisdictional challenge in motion, and the knowledge that somewhere in the imperial capital, a commissioner who had been building a case for months had just received the document that changed everything. Lucian walked out beside her. Not behind her. Beside her. Breck watched from the gate with an expression that was mostly professional and slightly something else. And Sana watched from the kitchen window with her arms crossed, and the 2 stable boys who had been crossing the yard stopped and watched, and for a moment the whole manor was very still, in the way that moments are still when they're becoming something that will be talked about later. Then they walked through the gate together, and the soldiers fell in around them, and the road went south toward the valley, and whatever was coming came. The road south took 3 hours at a steady pace, and for most of those 3 hours nobody said anything worth recording. Olin rode at the front with 4 soldiers. 4 more rode at the rear. The remaining 4 positioned themselves on either side of the small carriage that Evelyn had insisted on, rather than horses, on the grounds that if they were going to the Valley Administrative Court, She intended to arrive looking like herself, and not like someone who had been dragged. Allen had agreed to the carriage with the expression of a man who had stopped arguing with her on principle. Inside the carriage, Evelyn and Lucien sat across from each other in the narrow space, and the road was bad enough in winter that conversation required effort. He said, after the first hour, "You should have stayed." "You said that at the gate. I didn't agree with it then either." If this goes wrong, I need to be there to make it go less wrong," she said. "Sitting at the manor waiting for news is not a thing I do." He looked at her in the thin winter light coming through the carriage window. "I know. Do you have a problem with that?" A pause. "No. I'm trying to figure out how to say that I'm—" He stopped. Outside, the road hit a rough section and the carriage jolted, and he put a hand to the wall to steady himself, and she put her feet flat on the floor and held the seat edge, and for a moment they were just two people in a rattling box on a bad winter road. He said, when the road smoothed again, "I'm not used to someone coming with me." She looked at him. "I know. That's all I was trying to say." "I know that too." She turned back to the window. "Mercer will be there before us. He left an hour ahead." He nodded, and they didn't speak again for the rest of the road. But the silence had changed character from the silences earlier in the journey. Less careful, more like the silence between people who have said the important thing and don't need to say it again. The Valley Administrative Court was a stone building in the center of the market district that had been built to look more imposing than it functioned. Mercer was waiting on the steps with his briefcase and the look of a man who had been waiting long enough to be cold, but not long enough to be worried, which told Evelyn that nothing catastrophic had happened in the 3 hours since she'd left. He fell into step beside her as they entered. Allen had his 12 soldiers, which drew attention from the merchants and clerks moving through the market district, which was either bad because it was visible or useful because it was visible, depending on what you wanted people to notice. "At least people have been in contact," Mercer said quietly. "The document is being reviewed at the capital level. I don't have a timeline, but I have confirmation it's active." "How active?" "Active enough that the commissioner's office sent a courier to the frontier district this morning." He glanced at Lucien. "They want a formal statement of circumstances from you. When you gave the warning to the settlements, who you informed, what the chain of command looked like. The document establishes the order. The statement establishes that it was carried out against your refusal." "That means testifying," Lucien said. "Eventually, yes. Against Vale." "Against Vale." Mercer said it plainly. "I want to be clear about what that means for your security in the short term. Vale has resources, and he has people watching this process. Once your testimony is formally on record, the practical value of silencing you is reduced because the information is already in the system. But between now and then, I understand the window," Lucien said. "Good." Mercer pushed open the court building door. "Then let's see what Allen actually has." What Allen had, spread across the administrative court table in a room that smelled like old paper and coal heat, was more than Evelyn had expected, and less than she'd feared. The provincial authority documentation was legitimate. She'd known it would be this time. The summons for Lucien was properly constructed. The security provision citation was the weakest element, and Mercer went for it immediately, laying out in the flat, methodical language of a man who had done this many times. Why the provision, while technically applicable, required a finding of active threat that the provincial office had not actually made, had only asserted. The court clerk, a middle-aged man named Pell, who had the look of someone who had been in this room for 20 years and had seen every variation of bureaucratic aggression, listened to Mercer's argument with the careful attention of a person who was going to have to write up what happened and wanted to get it right. Allen's legal representative, a younger man named Crane, who was clearly sharper than Allen himself, argued the other side competently. He had a prepared counter to the active threat question, a supplementary document from Corvain asserting that Lucien's possession of sensitive imperial military documentation constituted an ongoing security matter. Lucien, sitting beside Evelyn at the respondents' table, said, very quietly, just to her, "He doesn't know the document is already in the commissioner's hands." She said nothing but shifted her weight slightly, which he recognized by now as her version of agreement. Mercer had clearly been waiting for the sensitive documentation argument because he produced his counter to it without pause. A certified letter from Commissioner Adley's office confirming receipts of materials related to an active investigative branch inquiry, which meant that the document in question was now evidence in an imperial-level investigation and could not be characterized as a unilateral security threat held by a private individual. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has shifted and everyone is recalibrating. Crane looked at the letter, read it twice. Looked at Olin, who was looking at Crane with the expression of a man waiting to be told what just happened. Pell, the court clerk, said, "Mr. Crane, does the provincial office wish to maintain the security provision citation in light of this?" Crane said he needed a recess to consult. Pell gave him 20 minutes. Evelyn used the 20 minutes to drink the terrible court coffee and stand by the window that looked out over the market district, where the 12 soldiers who had ridden down from her gate were now arranged in the yard outside in a configuration that was starting to draw a crowd of curious market-goers and merchants who had nothing better to do with a winter afternoon than watch official proceedings from a distance. Lucien came to stand beside her. "Crane will drop the security provision." "Yes." "But Olin will insist on maintaining the summons for the provincial court review. The investigative branch inquiry doesn't automatically dissolve the provincial process." "Mercer knows that." Mercer's next move will be to argue that the provincial review is premature given the active imperial inquiry. He was quiet for a moment. "He's good." "He's very good," she agreed. "Where did you find him?" "He found me. He came to the manor 8 years ago to challenge a licensing dispute, representing the other side. He was so thorough in beating me that I hired him immediately afterward." Something moved across Lucien's face. "You hired the lawyer who beat you." "I hire competence. What it was previously pointed at is irrelevant." She looked at him sideways, like stable management systems and guard rotation charts. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what Mercer said. The testimony." "I know. It means going on record. Formally. There's no walking it back once it's done." "I know that too. Vale is not... He's not the kind of man who accepts a political loss and moves on. He'll come after whatever he can reach." She turned to face him fully, with the market district behind her through the dirty window and the coal heater ticking in the corner. "Are you asking me if I want you to protect me from this by handling it quietly and going away somewhere?" He met her eyes, said nothing. "Because the answer is no," she said. "I want you to tell the truth and let the process do what it exists to do. And I want you to do it here, where I can see it, and not somewhere alone where you've decided again that you're better off not letting anyone close enough to matter." His jaw tightened. "That's accurate?" A long pause. "Yes." "Then stop trying to manage this for my benefit," she said. "I'm a better judge of my own benefit than you are." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to recognize as the one that meant he was surprised, again, by the ordinary fact of being talked to like that, directly, without softening, without the careful distance of someone who expected him to break, like someone who thought he could handle the truth. "Crane's 20 minutes is almost up," she said. "Let's go back in." Crane dropped the security provision. Mercer argued premature process. Pell listened with the careful attention of a man doing his job correctly, and ruled that, given the active investigative branch inquiry, the provincial summons would be stayed, not dismissed, stayed, pending the outcome of the imperial-level review. It was not a victory exactly. The summons still existed. The provincial process was paused, not ended. Olin left the building with the wooden expression of a man who would be making a difficult report to Corvain before the day was out. But Lucien walked out of the court building not in provincial custody, and that was what mattered for today. Mercer said, standing on the court steps in the cold afternoon, "This buys time. The investigative branch process will take weeks, possibly months. In that period, Vael's people will be active." "Define active," Evelyn said. "I mean they won't send magistrates with paperwork. Paperwork has been neutralized for now." He paused. "I mean the other category of pressure." The 12 soldiers were still in the yard, milling with the particular restlessness of men who had been given an assignment that had partially collapsed and weren't sure what to do now. Olin was conferring with Crane near the horses. The market crowd had mostly dispersed, but 3 or 4 people were still watching from the market stalls across the street. One of them, Evelyn noticed, was watching specifically at Lucien, not with the casual interest of a bystander, with the fixed professional attention of someone who was there for a purpose. She didn't look directly at the man. She said quietly to Lucien, "Third stall from the left. Gray coat." He didn't look either. "I saw him when we came in. Friend of yours? Not the kind that does you favors." He kept his voice level. "He's been there since we arrived. He's not from Olin's group. Wrong posture. Different employer. Bales. Most likely." Mercer, who had caught enough of this exchange to understand, said, "The carriage?" "The carriage," Evelyn agreed. "Mercer, can you arrange an overnight at your office for tonight? I don't want to ride the 3 hours back in the dark." "Already anticipated that. I have 2 rooms." "Make it 3. Mercer looked at Lucien, then back at her. "3 rooms," he said, without comment, and went to arrange it. The 3 rooms at Mercer's office building were small and cold, and smelled like document storage, which they essentially were. Sana had sent food in the carriage. She had done this without being asked, which told Evelyn that Sana had decided to be prepared for the possibility of an overnight and had acted on that decision without instructions, which was its own kind of statement about where things stood. They ate in Mercer's actual office, which was large enough for 3 people to sit without crowding. Mercer went through the next steps: the formal statement for the investigative branch, the timeline for the provincial stay, the communications he needed to send in the morning, practical and specific and holding no more weight than the work itself. Lucien ate without tasting it. She could tell. He was still running calculations in his head. She could see it in the way his eyes moved, slow and steady, not looking at anything in the room. When Mercer finally excused himself to write the letters that needed to go out first thing, she and Lucien were left in the office with the remains of Sana's food and the coal stove and the evening dark pressing against the window. "The man in the gray coat will have reported by now," Lucien said. "Yes." "Vale knows the document is in the commissioner's hands." "Yes." "He'll move to discredit the testimony before it's given. That means coming after the circumstances, the chain of events leading to the refusal, the people I told, the adjutant who delivered the copies." He looked at his hands. "My adjutant was a man named Ferris. Good man, 22 years old when he made those copies." He paused. "I don't know where Ferris is now. Can Mercer find out?" "Mercer can try." He was quiet for a moment. "Vale will also try." She looked at him across the desk. "What happened to Ferris after you left?" "He was reassigned. I made sure of that before I resigned. I made it clear in the paperwork that he had acted under direct order and wasn't aware of the full implications of what he was copying. Whether that held—" He stopped. "I don't know." She noted, and did not say, that this was another entry in the long list of things Lucien Ashcombe had done carefully and correctly for other people's benefit, and then walked away from before he could know whether it had worked. "We'll find out," she said. He looked at her. "Evelyn, I need to say something." "All right." He put his hands flat on the desk, the same gesture she'd first noticed in the records room weeks ago. "When this is resolved, one way or another, the reason for me to stay at Silverheart is—" He stopped, started again. "I came to your gate because I ran out of road. I stayed because there was work to do, but I'm aware that I've taken considerable advantage of your generosity, and I don't want to assume it—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. "You're about to say something carefully calculated to give me an easy way to ask you to leave," she said. "In case I want to." He didn't answer. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. A long pause. "No." "Then why are you offering me the option?" "Because it's the right thing to do. Because what I've brought to your door is also the most interesting 7 weeks I've had in 12 years, she said, and immediately regretted it, not because it wasn't true, but because it was more true than she'd meant to hand him without warning. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and the coal stove ticked, and the office was very quiet. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "This." He gestured slightly, vaguely, encompassing something that included the room and her and everything that had been accumulating for 7 weeks. I know how to command things. I know how to build systems and find gaps and fix what's broken. I don't know how to... He stopped again. I've been alone for a long time. Longer than 18 months, technically. You can be surrounded by 11,000 men and be completely alone. I know, she said. I don't want to do it badly. You're already doing it, she said. You just don't know what to call it because you've been measuring by outcomes and this isn't an outcome yet. He looked at her with something that was not quite the expression she'd cataloged before. Something raw. What is it then? He asked. It's a situation in progress, she said, like the Eastern textile route, a long game. He was quiet. Then, very quietly, I'm not good at waiting. I've noticed. You fix walls at dawn. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She felt it the same way she felt the coal stove heat. Not dramatic, but present and real. Get some sleep, she said, standing. Mercer's going to need us early and the rooms are cold and there's nothing more to solve tonight. She walked to the door. He said her name, just her name, and she stopped. Thank you, he said, for coming today. She didn't turn around because she couldn't arrange her face quite correctly yet. Thanks, Sana. She packed the food. She went to her room and lay on the narrow bed in the document smelled dark and looked at the ceiling and thought, carefully and practically, about all the things that still needed doing. Ferris, the testimony, the investigative branch timeline, the provincial stay, the man in the gray coat, and whoever he'd reported to. There was a great deal still to do. She was not afraid of it. They were back at Silverheart by noon the following day, and by mid-afternoon the manor had returned to something like its normal operational rhythm, which was either reassuring or deceptive depending on how you looked at it. Evelyn chose reassuring and went back to work. The next 10 days moved fast. Mercer located Ferris, or rather, confirmed that Ferris was locatable, which was better than the alternative. He'd been posted to a western frontier garrison, far enough from the central provinces to suggest that someone had wanted him inconvenient to reach, but not important enough to deal with more directly. Mercer got a letter to him through channels that bypassed the provincial postal system, and Ferris wrote back in 4 days, a short letter, tightly controlled, that said he remembered clearly and would testify if it came to that. Lucien read the letter twice and put it down on the table and said nothing for a moment. He's all right, Evelyn said. He's 23 years old and he's been posted to a western garrison because of what I asked him to do. He knew what he was copying. He was following my order. Lucicia. She waited until he looked at her. He wrote back. He said he would testify. He's not a victim of what you did. He's a participant in it. Let him be that. He absorbed this. You're good at that. At what? Telling me when I'm taking responsibility for things that aren't mine to own. You have a significant catalog of things that are genuinely yours to own, she said. I'm just keeping it accurate. He looked at her with the expression she still didn't quite have a name for. The raw one. I know. The investigative branch sent its own courier on the 12th day. Not paperwork, a person, a quiet woman named Sella, who arrived at the gate with a single bag and a letter of introduction from Commissioner Adley and the manner of someone who had been doing sensitive imperial work long enough to have stopped finding it dramatic. She spent 2 days at Silverheart, which were the strangest 2 days the manor had seen in its history. She interviewed Lucien for 6 hours the first day in the study, with Mercer present and Evelyn deliberately absent because Lucien had asked her not to be there for that part, and she'd agreed, on the grounds that he needed to be able to say things without managing how she heard them. She kept herself busy in the warehouse those 6 hours. Tomas told her afterward that she'd reorganized the East Wall storage system with an energy that suggested something was being worked through. That evening, Sela came to Evelyn's study and sat across from her with the directness of a professional used to saying difficult things efficiently. Lord Protector Vial will know about our contact within days, she said. He has sources in the commissioner's office. That's not a secret. It's a known problem we're managing. When he knows, his approach to this situation will change. Change how? The legal channels are effectively closed to him now. The document is in the imperial record. The testimony will be in the record. The only remaining leverage he has is direct. She paused. I want to be honest with you about what that means. The investigative branch can provide some protection, but we're not a military body. Our reach in the frontier territories is administrative. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that between now and the conclusion of the investigation, you and Mr. Ashcombe are vulnerable in ways that legal process can't fully address. She met Evelyn's eyes. I want to know what resources you have. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Breck, she said. Come in. Breck appeared in the doorway. He'd been in the corridor. He'd been in the corridor for the past hour, which told Evelyn he'd assessed the situation and positioned himself accordingly without being asked. Breck knows this estate and its people better than anyone, Evelyn said to Sella. Tell him what you need. Sella told him. It was specific and professional and assumed a level of competence in her audience that Breck clearly found appropriate, because he nodded as she spoke and asked 2 questions, both of which were the right questions. I'll need 2 more men on the north approach overnight, he said when she'd finished, and I want to change the external lamp pattern. Right now it's predictable enough that someone watching from the ridge could map the patrol timing. Do it, Evelyn said. I'll need Mr. Lucien for the planning. You'll have him. She said it straightforwardly, and Breck received it the same way, and neither of them made anything of the possessive, though Sella glanced at Evelyn briefly with an expression that suggested she had filed something away. Lucien and Breck spent the following morning walking the manor perimeter together, which was a thing that would have seemed strange 6 weeks ago and seemed entirely natural now. She watched them from the study window, 2 men of similar build but entirely different history, moving through the winter yard with the particular focused ease of people assessing a space they intended to defend. She thought about what Sella had said. Direct leverage. The legal channels closing behind Vael as the imperial process moved forward, and whatever he decided to do instead. She thought about it the way she thought about the barge contractor problem and the Dorval situation, not with fear, but with the practical clarity of someone who understood that unpleasant things coming toward you were better met with a plan than with hope. Mercer came to find her at noon. He had papers, which was his version of arriving with armor on. The stay on the provincial summons will be formalized tomorrow, he said. That's the clean part, the messy part. He set a document on her desk. Lord Harwick's commission challenge has drawn a response from the capital. They've offered a compromise on the jurisdictional question. Harwick is inclined to take it. She looked at the document. The compromise removes the pressure from my licenses. It does. It also removes Harwick's political interest in continuing to support your situation because his objective is achieved. He'll withdraw. Not immediately, but the practical support, yes. Mercer sat down. Evelyn. Where are you in your thinking about what comes next? She looked at him. Be specific. If the investigative branch inquiry concludes in Ashcombe's favor, which I believe it will, the document is unambiguous, he'll be formally cleared. His resignation will be confirmed rather than treated as desertion. The ducal question is separate and more complicated, but the criminal exposure goes away. He paused, at which point he'll have options that don't include the northern frontier. She was quiet. I'm not telling you what to do, Mercer said carefully. I'm making sure you've thought about it. I've thought about it. And? She looked at the document on her desk. And it's not my decision to make for him. Mercer nodded. He gathered his papers and stood. For what it's worth, in 22 years of practice, I've watched a great many people decide things for reasons they told themselves were practical. He paused at the door. The reasons you're making your decisions aren't practical. No, she agreed. They aren't. He left her with that. Vail's move came on the 17th day, and it was neither legal nor subtle. 4 men came over the North Ridge at 2 in the morning. Not Allin, not provincial office, not anything with documentation. They came in the dark, and they came without announcing themselves, and the reason they didn't get further than the north fence line was that Breck had changed the lamp pattern 4 days earlier, and Lucien had identified the 2 positions on the North Ridge that provided the best sight lines to the manor interior, and they'd placed watchers at both positions from the first night. Evelyn was woken by Breck at 2:15. She dressed in the dark and went downstairs, and the brief account she received was that 4 men had been apprehended at the north fence, disarmed, and were currently in the storage barn under guard. None of her people had been hurt. One of the 4 men had a broken wrist from the encounter, which was the most violence the whole thing had produced. Lucien was already in the yard when she got there. He'd been awake. She could tell from the way he was dressed, fully, coat and boots, not the slightly disarrayed look of someone pulled out of sleep. "Did you know tonight?" she asked. "I thought tonight or tomorrow night was likely." He was looking at the north ridgeline, visible against the slightly lighter dark of the winter sky. The timing from Selah's visit made the window predictable. "You should have told me." "I didn't want you losing sleep over something that might not happen." She looked at him. "Lucien, we talked about this." "I know." He looked back at her. "I'm still learning." She decided to accept this for now because it was 2 a.m. and there were 4 men in her barn. "What do we do with them?" "Selah, she needs to know about this tonight." He paused. "This is Vael making a move he can't walk back. He sent people to... I don't know exactly what their instructions were, but they weren't there to talk." She absorbed this without showing what it did to her insides. "I'll send for Selah." "Evelyn." She stopped. He was looking at her in the dark yard with the manor behind him, and the winter sky above, and his face was doing the raw thing again, the unguarded thing, except this time he didn't seem to be trying to control it. "I know what I brought to your door," he said. "I want you to know that I know. I know you know." She held his gaze. "I also want you to know that no one forced me to open it." They stood in the cold yard, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched longer than yards in the dark at 2 a.m. usually allowed for. Then she said, "Go wake Mercer. I'll get Selah." He went, she went, and the night moved into its next phase, which was the phase where things that had been approaching for 17 days finally arrived completely, and there was nothing left to do but stand in the middle of them and hold. Selah, when she heard about the 4 men, said only, "Good." Then she pulled out her materials and started writing the communique to Commissioner Adley that would turn 4 men in a storage barn into the specific piece of evidence that closed the remaining distance between Lord Protector Vale and what was coming for him. She worked by lamplight at the kitchen table while Sana, who had also been woken and had decided the correct response was to make coffee for everyone, moved around her with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that some nights called for practical action and some nights called for coffee, and this night clearly called for both. Lucienne sat across from Selah and answered her questions precisely and without embellishment. Mercer reviewed each answer before it went into the record. Breck stood in the doorway and said nothing, which was what Breck did when he was making sure nothing came through the doorway. Evelyn sat at the end of the table and watched all of it, and felt, underneath the adrenaline and the cold and the particular specific fear she was refusing to fully acknowledge, something else, something quieter and harder to name. The feeling of a room full of people doing the right thing in the middle of the night because it was what needed doing. She'd built this place for 12 years. She'd built it to run, to function, to be reliable and useful, and worth the effort of getting up every morning. She'd built it alone, mostly, in the ways that mattered. It didn't feel entirely alone anymore, and she didn't know yet what to do with that, but she noted it with the same careful attention she gave the ledger numbers and the route manifests, and filed it somewhere she could come back to when the night was over and the work was done. The 4 men in the storage barn didn't talk easily, but they talked. Selah was patient in the way that people are patient when they already have most of what they need and are simply waiting for confirmation. By dawn, she had names, and by mid-morning, she had enough to send a second communique to Commissioner Adley that was considerably more specific than the first. She sealed it herself and gave it to a courier she'd brought with her, a young man who had been sleeping in the gatehouse and who departed at a pace that suggested he understood what he was carrying. Breck kept the 4 men in the barn under 2-man watch. They were fed. Their wrist injury was looked at by the estate's resident physician, a practical woman named Dr. Hess, who had been with Silverheart for 6 years, and who set the break with the clean efficiency of someone who had stopped letting context affect her professional function. The man with the broken wrist thanked her and then said nothing else to anyone. Evelyn slept for 3 hours in the late morning, which was not enough and was everything she was going to get. She woke to Sana's knock and a tray and the sound of the manor going about its day outside the bedroom window, ordinary and relentless and exactly what she'd built it to be. She lay there for a moment before getting up, listening to the sounds of the place. Wagon wheels in the yard, someone calling to someone else about the second warehouse delivery. The particular rhythm of 50 people doing their work, which had been the background sound of her mornings for 12 years, and which she realized, almost stopped hearing until recently, because it had been there so long it had become invisible the way walls become invisible. She heard it now, all of it. She got up and went back to work. The investigative branch moved faster than Mercer had predicted, which he said later was unusual enough to indicate that Adley had been waiting for exactly this kind of consolidated evidence and had been prepared to act quickly when it arrived. The formal inquiry results came to Silverheart by Imperial Courier 23 days after Sela's departure, a document that was dense with procedural language but whose essential content reduced to several clear findings. Lord Protector Vale's signed order had been authenticated. The order's directive was determined to constitute an unlawful command under the Empire's own military conduct statutes. The 4 men apprehended at Silverheart's north fence were confirmed agents of Vale's private security apparatus. Lucian Ashcomb's refusal to execute the order and his subsequent resignation were formally reclassified from desertion to conscientious refusal, which carried entirely different legal standing. His warning to the Eastern Ridge settlements, previously characterized as treason, was reclassified as a protected action under the same statute. Vale himself was under formal Imperial investigation with his powers as Lord Protector suspended pending the outcome. Deputy Administrator Corvain had resigned the previous week, which had not been in the news that reached the frontier, but which Sela had apparently expected because she'd mentioned it to Mercer in passing without surprise. Mercer brought the document to Evelyn's study and set it on the desk and said, "Read page 4 first. The rest is process language." She read page 4, then she read the rest. "Is this complete?" she asked. "For now. The investigation into Vile continues. He'll face proceedings that could take months, but Ashcomb's legal standing is restored and the provincial license review is formally withdrawn." Mercer paused. "The ducal question is also addressed, in the appendix." She turned to the appendix. It was brief, a single paragraph noting that the Ashcombe ducal title and its associated properties and records remained legally intact under imperial succession law, and that the holder was at liberty to reassert or formally renounce the title through the appropriate channels within 1 year. She read the paragraph twice. "He has a choice," she said. "He has a choice," Mercer confirmed. "He can take the title back, or he can renounce it formally and it ends with him." He gathered his briefcase. "I'll leave you to tell him. He's in the records room." She found him exactly where Mercer said he would be. He was not working. He was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface and nothing in front of him, which was so unlike his usual presence in that room that she stopped in the doorway for a moment. "You already know," she said. "Sela sent word ahead." He didn't look up immediately. "How much of it?" "All of it." She came in and sat across from him and put the document on the table between them. He looked at it without touching it. "Have you read the appendix?" "Sela read it to me this morning." She waited. "A year to decide," he said. "Yes." He looked at the document. "The Ashcombe holdings in the central provinces are significant. There are people on those estates, tenant farmers, workers, who have been under interim imperial administration since I left. They've been without consistent leadership for 18 months. I know. That's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. It was quiet for, when I walked away, I told myself the title was just a name, that what mattered was the decision I made, not the position I left behind. He paused. That was partly true and partly a lie I told myself to make it easier to go. She said nothing, because this was the kind of thing that needed to be said in its own time. "The people on those estates are a real thing," he said, "not abstract. Real people on real land who need someone to make decisions that affect their lives." He looked at her. "Just like the people on the eastern textile route." She held his gaze. "Don't make this about me." "I'm not." He paused. "I'm making it about the fact that I've spent the past 8 weeks watching what it looks like when someone takes that kind of responsibility seriously, and I'm trying to figure out what the right thing is." "And?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer directly. Then he said, "I think I have to go back." The room was very still. "Not permanently," he said quickly. "I mean, I need to go to the central provinces, sort out the estates, establish proper management, make sure the people there have what they need. It could take months. It might take most of the year." He looked at the table. I'm not saying I want to. I'm saying I think I have to." Eveline looked at him for a long moment. At his hands flat on the table, the same gesture he used when he was being completely honest about something. At the scar on his left forearm, and the too long hair, and the borrowed house shirt that had been washed so many times, it had become just a shirt, not borrowed anymore. "Is that a question?" she asked. He looked up. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "Or telling me?" A beat. His expression shifted into the raw one, the unguarded one. "I don't know how to ask what I want to ask." "Try." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, "Will Silverheart still be here when I come back?" She looked at him steadily. "Silverheart will be here in 50 years. It was here before me. And it'll outlast me." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." She stood up. "Go sort out the estates, Lucien. Make sure the people there have what they need. Come back when it's done." "Eveline, I have 47 merchant relationships to maintain, and a river barge contractor to renegotiate with again in the spring, and a jurisdictional compromise with Harwick's commission to respond to." She picked up the investigative branch document. "I'm not going anywhere." He stood too. They were on opposite sides of the table, which was a small table, and the records room was a small room. "I'll be back before the year is out," he said. "I imagine you will." "I mean it." "I know you mean it." She moved toward the door, then stopped, turned, said, because it needed saying and she was done waiting for the right moment, "For what it's worth, you came in here with 3 copper coins and spent 8 weeks trying to give more than you took. Whatever happens with the title, whatever you decide about the estates, that's the man who's welcome here. Not the field marshal, not the duke. You. The one who fixes walls at dawn because the horses are restless." She paused. "Keep that one." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the raw one, not the tired one, not the focused one she knew from the warehouse and the records room. Something simpler than any of those. She went back to her study and closed the door and sat down at her desk and held herself very still for a moment before she could trust herself to pick up a pen. He left 4 days later. The preparations were practical and unhurried. Mercer drafted the legal documents that would formally initiate the ducal process from Lucien's end. Sella had provided introductory letters to the imperial administrators currently managing the Ashcombe estates, which would smooth the initial contact. Breck quietly sourced a good horse, not from the manor's working stock, a proper traveling horse, and had it ready without being asked. The morning he left, Sana produced breakfast for 2 in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, which was not the staff kitchen hour, but was the hour Eveline and Lucien had been using since the first week, and which Sana had apparently decided was now simply their hour without needing instruction. They ate without saying much. This was not awkward. They had become, over 8 weeks, people who knew how to be in the same space without needing to fill it, and that comfort was its own kind of answer to the things that hadn't yet been said directly. He told her about Ferris. Mercer had managed to get the young adjutant a formal commendation through the investigative branch process, which carried enough weight to have him reassigned from the Western Garrison posting to a position that actually suited his capabilities. Ferris had sent a letter to Lucien, care of Silverheart, that was 3 lines long and said he was glad it had worked out and he hadn't regretted it. "He's 23, Lucien said. "He could have spent years at that Western posting, but he didn't." She refilled her coffee. "Stop counting what could have been worse." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Is that advice you take yourself?" "Rarely, which is how I know it's worth giving." He almost smiled. She noted this the way she noted everything about him, carefully and without acknowledgement. When he stood to go, Mrs. Aldrich appeared from somewhere with his canvas sack, repacked, his clothes properly laundered and folded, and added to it several items from the kitchen stores that would be useful on a long ride. She handed it to him with the expression of a woman who was doing her job and not making anything of it, which was its own kind of statement. Breck brought the horse around to the front. Evelyn walked out with him. The morning was cold and clear. The particular winter clear that comes after a hard frost, where everything looks sharp-edged and the sky is pale and honest. The yard was empty except for Breck and the horse. He checked the saddlebag with the efficiency of habit, ran a hand along the horse's neck, and turned to face her. "The Harwick Compromise," he said. "Don't accept their first counter." "I know." "The barge contractor will try to add a fuel surcharge in the spring renegotiation. It's not in the contract." "I know." "The watch rotation Breck and I set up. If he wants to adjust the north approach coverage, have him consult me by letter before—" "Lucien." He stopped. "I've been running this estate for 12 years, she said. "A beat." "I know." He looked at her. He stopped again, and for a moment he had the expression of a man who was very aware that he was about to get on a horse and ride away from something he didn't want to ride away from, and wasn't sure how to hold that with any dignity. She reached out and straightened the collar of his coat. It was a small and ordinary gesture, the kind of thing you do for someone when you're comfortable with them, and she did it without thinking about it, which was how she knew it was true. He went very still. She took her hand back. "Before the year is out," she said. "Before the year is out," he said. "I promise." She stepped back. He mounted, settled, and looked at her one more time from the height of the horse, and she looked back in the cold, clear morning air, with the manor behind her and 47 merchant letters in her files, and a 12-year-old operation that was going to keep running because it had been built to keep running regardless. Then he rode south, and she watched until she couldn't see him anymore, and then she turned around and went back inside and told Mrs. Aldrich she needed fresh coffee and had a letter to draft to Harwick's commission. The months that followed were not easy, but they were not empty. The estate ran. It ran the way it had always run, which was to say through sustained effort and frequent small problems and the occasional larger problem and the constant vigilance of 50 people who had decided sometime over the past several months that this place was worth their effort. Evelyn renegotiated the barge contract in March. The contractor did attempt a fuel surcharge. She declined it with the specific language from the contract that Lucien had highlighted in his notes, which she had kept in the filing system under his name because it seemed like the right place for them. The contractor withdrew the surcharge. She sent a letter north to wherever Lucien currently was with a single line. "The fuel surcharge attempt was exactly where you predicted. It has been declined." His response came 2 weeks later and was 3 pages, which was apparently how he wrote letters, the same way he wrote margin notes, small and precise, and containing more information than the length suggested. He was managing the estates. The administrative situation was complicated. There were approximately 200 people in 3 villages whose welfare had been in limbo for 18 months, and the work of untangling that was slow and specific and required the kind of patience he was still developing in himself. "I counted them," he wrote. 207. "I find I can't stop counting." She wrote back, "Stop counting and start fixing. You know how to fix things." The letters became a rhythm. Not daily, there wasn't time for daily, on either end, but consistent, the way a good trade route is consistent, reliable enough to plan around. She told him about the Dorval Council ruling, which came down in April, and was decisive enough that Dorval had left the valley rather than face the consequences directly. She told him about the new merchant relationship she'd established with a family from the coast, which had taken 6 weeks to negotiate and was worth every hour. She told him that the young gate guard who had wanted to understand the watch rotation strategy had been promoted to head of North Gate, and that Breck had made the recommendation himself. He told her about Ferris, who had come to the Ashcombe Estates in the capacity of his new posting, and had turned out to be even better at administrative management than he'd been at military work, which Lucien described as both unsurprising and somehow still surprising. He told her about the ducal decision. He'd made it in May, in a letter that was shorter than usual. He was formally renouncing the title. The estates would be transitioned to a management trust with Ferris as its principal administrator, legally structured to protect the tenant rights of everyone currently living there. The title would end with him. He was filing the renunciation papers through Mercer's office. "I thought I needed to go back to make things right," he wrote. "I was correct that I needed to go back. I was wrong about what making it right would look like. Making it right meant making sure the people there didn't need me specifically, that the land and the welfare of those on it wouldn't depend on a title that I don't want and couldn't hold honestly. Ferris can do this better than I can. He wants to. I've spent 2 months watching him want to, and I know what it looks like when someone is doing the thing they're meant to do." She read that letter 3 times. Then she filed it in the same section as his warehouse notes and his shipping manifest annotations, under his name, where things she needed to be able to find later went. He came back in September. Not dramatically. He arrived in the mid-afternoon on a Tuesday, which was a market day in the valley, and the manor was in its usual midweek operational rhythm. Breck saw him coming up the south road and sent word ahead, which meant that by the time he reached the gate, it was open and Tomas was in the yard to take the horse with the efficiency of a man who had been expecting this particular animal for some time. Evelyn was in the warehouse when Breck's message arrived. She finished what she was doing, a count of the autumn inventory that needed to be completed before the day's light went, and then she walked out to the yard. He looked different and the same. Thinner, maybe, or just leaner in the way of someone who'd been working outdoors. His hair was still too long. He was wearing a coat that was actually his, she could tell, the right fit, worn in the right places. He was standing in the yard talking to Breck about something, and he had the quality she'd noticed in him from the beginning, the one that was hardest to name, the way he occupied whatever space he was in without taking it over. He turned when he heard her come out. She walked across the yard to where he was standing and stopped at a reasonable distance and said, "You said before the year." "September is before the year." "Barely. I was accounting for complications." He looked at her. "There were complications." "I know. Your letters were specific about the complications." "Your letters were specific about the fuel surcharge." "The fuel surcharge was important." "The fuel surcharge was one line," he said. "You sent 12 pages about the coastal merchant negotiation." "It's a complex negotiation." He looked at her with the expression that had no name, the simple one. "I read all 12 pages," he said. "Twice." She looked back at him. The afternoon light was the low gold of early autumn, and the yard smelled like hay and cold air coming in from the north. And behind him the manor was solid and steady and completely itself, the way it had been for 30 years, the way it would be for 30 more. "The Meridian Suite is available," she said. Something moved across his face. "It's been available all year?" "It's been available since the first morning you had breakfast in the kitchen." She held his gaze. "I told you, nobody else needed it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't have 3 copper coins this time. I'm aware of your financial situation. You renounced a dukedom." "I did." He paused. "I may need to earn my room." "You reorganized my entire warehouse system and saved 3 caravans and identified 6 deficits in my route operations and rebuilt the watch rotation," she said. "You're ahead." The sound he made was the closest thing to a real laugh she'd ever heard from him. It was brief and slightly rough and completely unperformed, and she felt it in the same way she felt the coal stove heat, not dramatic, but present and real and exactly as warm as it needed to be. "Come inside," she said. "Sana made something with the river catch this morning, and she won't say so, but she's been warming it for the past hour." He fell into step beside her. Not behind, beside, the same way he'd walked out of the court building in the valley 9 months ago, and they went through the manor door together into the smell of coal heat and good food and the particular lived-in solidity of a place that had been cared for by someone who knew what they were doing. There are things that look like luck from the outside. The wealthiest woman in the northern frontier gives a penniless traveler her finest room. The traveler turns out to be a disgraced duke with a military mind and a document that could topple a Lord Protector. The document does what it was meant to do. The duke renounces his title and comes back with nothing but himself, and the woman who built her fortune on reading situations accurately decides that's enough. From the outside, that's a lucky story. A story about the right person showing up at the right time. But Evelyn Hawthorne had learned, over 12 years of running a business that had survived fraudulent merchants and corrupt officials and 2 separate attempts at hostile acquisition, that luck is mostly what happens when preparation meets the right kind of attention. You don't build something worth keeping by waiting for things to go well. You build it by being honest about what's broken and fixing it carefully, over and over, even when fixing it is slow and unglamorous, and the results don't show up until a season or 2 later. What she and Lucien had built in those first 8 weeks, and then across the months of letters and distance, wasn't luck. It was the slow accumulation of small, accurate choices. To say the true thing instead of the careful thing, to stay when leaving would have been easier. To trust someone with the working parts of your life, and then actually let them touch those parts. It wasn't smooth. He was not a smooth person. He woke up too early, and he noticed things obsessively, and he still, months later, occasionally said things calculated to protect her from something she hadn't asked to be protected from. And she told him so, directly, every time, which was apparently what was required. She was not a smooth person either. She held her cards too long and trusted too slowly and had a way of making decisions without fully explaining the reasoning that drove Mercer slightly insane and sometimes made Lucien sit across from her with the expression of a man trying to read a document in a language he mostly knew. What they were, together, was honest. And that turned out to be the thing that held. The following spring, a merchant from the valley arrived at Silverheart with a letter of introduction from Harwick's commission and the hopeful expression of someone looking for his first northern frontier trade relationship. Breck showed him to the reception room, and while he waited, he looked around at the portraits on the wall and the ledgers visible through the study window, and the general air of a place that was efficient and real and had no particular interest in appearing to be anything other than what it was. He was received by Evelyn Hawthorne, who looked at his letter and asked him 2 direct questions about his operation and decided in approximately 4 minutes whether she wanted to do business with him. She did. They negotiated briefly and concluded on terms that were fair in the specific way that fair terms are, not easy for either side, but clear. As he was leaving, he passed through the outer yard and saw a man in the warehouse doorway reviewing a manifest with 2 of the warehouse workers. The man was explaining something to them, not telling them what to do, asking them questions, the way someone asks questions when they want the person they're asking to find the answer themselves. The merchant stopped and asked Breck, who was nearby, who the man in the doorway was. Breck considered the question for a moment. "He manages operations," he said. "Mostly. He's not the estate manager. He seems like he's running things." "He helps run things," Breck said. "The estate has its own manager." "Who's that?" Breck nodded toward the study window where Evelyn was already back at her desk. "Lady Hawthorne runs the estate." The merchant looked at the woman at the desk and the man in the warehouse doorway, and the general organized reality of a place that had clearly been built by someone who knew what they were doing and was currently being operated by people who knew what they were doing, and he said, "They seem like partners." Breck said, "Yes," and left it at that. Because some things are both exactly what they appear to be and considerably more complicated, and the simplest answer is usually the truest one. There is a room at Silverheart Manor that does not appear in the occupancy ledger. It appears in the maintenance records because rooms have to be cleaned and aired regardless of whether they're occupied. It appears in Mrs. Aldrich's inventory because furniture must be accounted for. But in the ledger, where Evelyn's bookkeeper records which guest occupied which room and when, the Meridian Suite has a single entry from a single winter night, and then nothing after, a blank that runs from that point forward for as long as the ledger goes. Mrs. Aldrich, when a new member of staff once asked about it, said only that the room was reserved. When the new staff member asked for whom, Mrs. Aldrich gave her a look that suggested the question, while technically reasonable, was missing something obvious. "For the person who's in it," she said, and moved on. What Lucien Ashcombe learned, over the months and years of being in a place rather than moving through it, was something he hadn't expected to have to learn at his age. He'd learned military strategy at 17 and administrative law at 20 and supply chain management at 23. He'd learned to read terrain and read people and read the gap between what a situation appeared to be and what it actually was. He'd learned all of those things before he'd had to learn the much simpler and considerably harder skill of accepting that somewhere was home. Home, it turned out, was not a place where you were entirely comfortable. It was a place where you were known, where the things that were difficult about you were visible and accounted for and incorporated rather than managed around. Where the woman across the desk from you told you, directly, that you were being an idiot about something and was correct, and you were able to receive that without having to protect yourself from it. He fixed things at Silverheart because things needed fixing and he was good at it, and because the fixing was real and mattered to real people. He fixed the wall in the South Garden 4 more times over the years because the stones kept shifting in the winter frost, and each time he fixed it, he did it the same way he'd done it the first morning, with whatever materials were available and whatever time he had before the rest of the estate was awake. Evelyn watched him do this on the 4th occasion, standing in the South Garden on a February morning with her coffee, watching him work, and said, "You know the groundskeeper is perfectly capable of doing that." "I know." He finished the section and stood up. "But then I'd have to wait for it to get on his list." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that were fundamentally him, that she had no interest in changing. "The horses aren't even restless this winter. I checked." "The gap was there," he said. "Things that are there need fixing." She sipped her coffee. The winter morning was pale and honest and cold, in the way that February mornings are cold when the year is just starting to turn toward the idea of spring without fully committing to it yet. The manor was waking up behind them, the kitchen starting its day, the first of the stable boys crossing the yard. "One more thing," Lucian said. She looked at him. "I know you're renegotiating the Harwick Commission terms next month." "I am." "Don't bring Mercer." She raised an eyebrow. Mercer is excellent, but the Commission reads him as adversarial at this point. They'll concede more if they're negotiating with you directly." He picked up the trowel. "Their representative has a tell. He taps the table when he's at his limit. He did it 3 times in the last negotiation, and you stopped before he reached it." She looked at him steadily. "How do you know what he did in the last negotiation? You weren't there." He paused. "Mercer described it in one of his letters." "Mercer doesn't write letters to you." A beat. "He mentioned it in your letter, the one in August." "My August letter was about the coastal merchant." He looked at the trowel in his hand. "I may have asked Mercer to keep me informed." She stared at him. "You had Mercer sending you supplementary reports." "I was managing the Ashcombe estates. I couldn't be here. I wanted to know that things were—" "You wanted to know that things were what?" she said, and her voice had a quality in it that was close to laughter but hadn't quite gotten there. "Running properly? Did you think I couldn't—" "I knew you could," he said. "I just wanted to know." He met her eyes. "I missed it." She looked at him. "I missed it," he said again, simpler. "All of it." She took a breath, let it out, looked at the repaired section of wall. "Next time you want to know something about what's happening here," she said, "you could try asking me directly." "Yes," he said. "I'm still learning." "I know." She finished her coffee. "The Harwick negotiation. You're right about Mercer. I'll go alone." She turned back toward the house. "Come to breakfast. Santa made the potato thing." "The one with the—" "Yes." He put the trowel down and followed her in, and the South Garden was quiet behind them, and the repaired wall held against the February cold, and the estate went on being what it had always been, a place worth caring for, run by people who knew the difference between surviving and choosing to stay. That is the thing, in the end, that no ledger records and no legal document captures. Not the ducal renunciation or the investigative branch ruling or the 47 merchant letters or the provincial stay. Not even the room that stays empty in the occupancy book. What it comes down to is this. A woman who had been alone in every way that mattered, looked at a man arriving at her gate with nothing and saw not what he'd lost but what remained. And a man who had spent years moving through the world without landing anywhere looked at a place that was real and cared for and worth the effort, and finally, let himself stop. Not because it was perfect, because it was true. And sometimes, if you're paying attention and willing to fix the gaps when you find them, true is more than enough.